All right, good morning. Back on the record for case 9618, and we're going to have staff's presentation, the last formal presentation that we'll have in this today's hearing. So, go ahead.
Good morning, Chair, Commissioners. I'm Michael Dean. On behalf of staff, I'd also like to enter the appearance of Lloyd Spivak. And with me today is Drew McAuliffe, David Valcarengi, Samarit Derrier, and Jamie Smith. And starting off with the presentation, this slide here just discusses the current multi-year rate plan model, and I don't think we need to spend much time on that. Let's go to general observations. We filed comments, and we noted that current multi-year plans include very limited quantitative benefit information, and such information is really needed in future filings to support the staff's review of the plans. We note that there's asymmetries of information which tend to impede our review of projects since they have the information, and we have to ask the right questions to obtain it. The annual filings do not adequately support or defend overall spending, which tends to transfer the risk of incorrect decisions to other parties. Enhanced filing requirements will be necessary for a proper review of multi-year rate plan spending, and implementation of an annual sharing mechanism or other cost containment strategies may be warranted. Just based on the recent filings of the plans, we believe that the multi-year rate plan rate-making process should be discretionary, and utilities should request authorization to use the multi-year rate plan process prior to filing an application, or alternatively file a notice of intent to file an application. And the Commission should determine the filing date for the utilities multi-year plan application based upon its calendar. That's to avoid overlapping review of plans or new applications, since they're so resource intensive. For the filing requirements, enhanced filing requirements would better assist parties and the Commission in evaluating projects. Each project above a certain dollar threshold should include quantitative benefits that the project's expected to achieve. Projects should break down the resources that are expected to be utilized into labor, materials, and outside costs. And projects should be supported by written testimony for all projects above a certain threshold. In addition, projects should be classified into significant categories that are driving business decisions, or rather, whether they are reliability, replacements, new business, customer service, legislative requirements, or administration, to aid in our review. And no amount of spending should be classified in the miscellaneous categories in either the project list or the schedule of projects for the coming year. Multi-year rate plan filings and updates should include discussions of changes from the initial budget to those reflected in the current or updated project list. And these reports should discuss these changes implemented for that year. The annual information filing should show projects that have closed and those that have been deferred and the reasons for the deferment. For the reconciliation process, companies should clearly identify what work from the budget or project list is closed and moved into utility plant by project. The utility should also quantify whether the intended benefits from the project have been achieved, and if not, why. There should also be testimony that identifies changes that have occurred to the project set forth in the annual project list and the reason for the change. Final annual costs should be broken into component resources, including labor, materials, and outside costs, and an explanation for any differences from those set out in the project list. Also, utilities should provide a schedule that shows the projects that have, from the project list that have closed and the spend that has been moved into plant since the last plant balances that have been approved. And utilities should provide testimony that shows the final spending for the year for capital and O&M costs, that it's most reasonable and efficient. And this is to answer the question of whether the annual spend is in line with the budgets and whether the budgets or the benefits are consistent. And we have a suggested cost control mechanism, and the current model provides recovery of differences in costs, and interest is applied to over earnings. And you've seen cost sharing mechanisms suggested, earnings shared around a 50 basis point deadband around the return on rate of return, or earnings above or below shared on a 50% basis, and sharing targets may need to be refined. And we're available for questions on our filings or on our presentation.
Okay, questions from the commission. Commissioner Richard.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and yeah, thank you for the staff presentation, and I think very thorough comments that you submitted. I guess listening to all the various parties, the generally consensus is that there's concerns that the pilot hasn't provided a lot of the benefits that were hoped for, and really maybe have not provided, I guess, the help or the advancing of state policies. Is that a fair assessment of your testimony as well?
Well, I wouldn't say that it hasn't achieved any benefits.
No, I'm not saying any, but it has it lived up to the I guess the aspirations as it's currently constructed?
Well, I think the original aspirations were broadly described, and so I don't think any pilot could achieve all those aspirations. But it is true that we did identify a lot of problems, and we've had trouble through discovery finding out or obtaining evidence that some of these policies and goals have been achieved.
Okay, and that's what I maybe characterize it that way. You've identified a lot of areas that probably need to look into if we continue with multi-year rate plans past the pilot. Is that a fair characterization, or is the current construct that was in the order creating the MYPs is that something we should just lock into place?
Well, when you say lock into place, are you talking about caps?
Thing on.
I'm talking about the construct, and I don't have the exact order number, but the order that created the construct for this pilot.
Well, I think the MYP is moving as intended. The problem that you're seeing in the case of BG&E is that we used a lot of accelerated deferred income taxes, which had an impact.
Okay.
And then
Is your mic on?
I
yeah.
think it is.
There's a little green.
Close enough.
Yeah, pull it a little closer then. Yeah.
So you had a number of changes after the plan went into effect that had an impact on the result. You had the use of accelerated deferred income taxes, which increased rate base in the out periods. You had the pandemic. You had various changes that are impacting the results. But the model is working as intended. Now, could we make it a better rocket ship? Absolutely. I think one of the things that could be vastly improved is providing better information around what's a reasonable cost. Right now, as I look at the cost in either BG&E's filings or PEPCO's filings, there's not a great deal of information from the companies that adequately demonstrate that the costs that they incurred are both reasonable and efficient, which automatically makes it such that the non-parties have to struggle with those decisions.
Okay. And I guess what I was trying to get to is that there are a lot of places where I kind of underline and put exclamation points in your testimony. It seemed to be areas where if we were to provide guidance from as far as next steps, those would be the areas we could identify. For instance, just grab one here on page 7. Predictability is undermined by the reconciliation process, and that goes to the fact that we may not have gotten the stability, the predictability that was hoped for as a benefit to ratepayers. So is that a good way of looking at various areas of your testimony as providing specific direction, guidance?
Direction and guidance is always a wonderful tool that can shape.
I'm trying to find out from your testimony where we could find areas of guidance and direction. That's all.
I think, yes, absolutely. Guidance is always a tool that can shape and modify in how we look at the mechanism before us and make it a better tool for both the commission and the parties.
Okay. It also for guidance. I was very interested in some of the dialogue that Commissioner Suchman had yesterday with parties on the idea of just a forecasted test year, more of a classic future forecasted test year, as maybe something to consider as far as guidance given to a work group, as possibly addressing some of the issues about, one, the utilities want to look through the windshield, not the rearview mirror, as far as they want to look toward what are state policies, but maybe also the other side, eliminating the need for reconciliation, the possibility of a little less resources requirements from the parties as far as looking at at what the plans are, just looking at all the elements of looking at capital plans and then reviewing prudency. I just want to get from staff's point of view, would that be something that would, again, help the resource issues that the staff currently says is required for MYPs, providing the forward-looking view, also perhaps reducing the number of filings for rate cases?
Well, I'm not sure how to respond to that.
I wonder if we bit off more than we can chew with multi-year and then just looking at just classic future test year, that's all.
Yeah, so your single forecasted test year base rate cases is what you're asking about?
Yeah.
Yeah, I frankly, it would just increase I don't think there would be a reduction in work personally, or administrative burden, because you just have rate cases every year for every utility that wants to file multi-year rate plans. So obviously all the Exelon utilities
What if it's just for the how long the utility, when the utility wanted to file? Does it have to come in every year?
Sure. Yeah. That's a fair point. I mean, I would still expect them to come in around every year if they're only getting one forecasted test year. And obviously, all the Exelon utilities have already filed, so I would see the cadence probably similar to their historic test year rate cases, where it would be probably 12 to 18-month periods between cases. And you still have to review 1 year worth of forecasted projects, and the accounting and engineering divisions would still have quite a workload. So personally, I don't think that would solve the problems, at least with the administrative workload. It would still be just rate cases year round, constantly, with hearings every couple months for a different utility, particularly if more utilities decided to start filing multi-year rate plans.
Okay, well, fair enough. And since Commissioner Suchman brought that up, I did do a quick, Google search, and so those are, less than adequate. But I would be interested, maybe staff to contemplate that and hear back from the utilities, because it seems like in many cases utilities don't come back yearly; that they can be enduring. So yeah, that may or may not be true, but again, that's what a quick Google search came up with. I guess the last question really is around what next steps. As you know, in the case number 9692 order, we specifically stated that the commission, after a lessons learned, may consider, under the extraordinary circumstances that call into question whether the existing rates are just and reasonable, that we may, after the lessons learned, we may consider invocation of an off-ramp provision. So I guess I just wanted, two parts of that question. If we see that, the commission wants to do some significant, repairs or reconstruction of the MYP, would that require an off-ramp, or is that something that could be done? And if we do an off-ramp to end the MYP, what happens to the existing, order that is currently governing BGE? I think DPL as well.
I think it would depend on the changes that you implemented. Certainly, I don't think you need an off-ramp. If you said the MRPs are going to end come 2025, then the rates that are currently in place, they would hold, and the utility would be, I think it would be up to them to file a traditional case if you said we're not going to do MRPs anymore.
It's been my observation that we have not front-loaded any of the rates for any of the companies, so that if we just stopped, we could maintain the existing rates in effect without harming ratepayers.
Okay. Well, what if it was a direction that we want to see if we could significantly fix the reconciliation process? Would that require an off-ramp to ensure that would apply to BGE and I believe DPL? Or is that something that could simply be done through a work group and then applied to the existing rates?
I think that could be applied to the current
I agree.
MRP that's in existence.
Okay. Very good. Thank you. I have no other questions.
Commissioner Suchman.
So actually, I wanted to focus on your testimony, or your comments, because in reading your comments, staff's comments, there seems to be a lot of concern. It actually, reading the comments, you seem much harder on the MYP process than you are in your oral testimony today. So I actually wanted to just go through so that I better understand what your concerns are. So why don't we start on page 4? And sort of they're in the two bullet points, first line for each, is unclear whether the MRP model has done anything to move state policy goals. Next bullet, it is unclear whether the MRP process has been successful in promoting state policy goals forward beyond traditional rate making. So I wonder if you can speak to those 2 points, because that was one of the values of doing an MYP, and if it's not promoting state goals, that's a problem. So I wonder if you can speak to those 2 points.
Sure, I can take that. So I guess I'm not sure rate cases are the place to advance state policy goals. So I'm not sure that really should necessarily a goal of the MRP should be to, I guess, not encumber or any state goals. So for example, BG filed various programs, as did PEPCO, for the Climate Solutions Now Act, and staff and other parties argued that should not be in a rate case because this is about distribution base rates, and they're trying to include all these policies and new initiatives that really aren't related to distribution base rates. So I'm not sure that really should necessarily be a goal of MRPs in general, because again, we usually handle those things outside of rate cases. So for example, electric vehicles has its own case number. That's a state policy goal, and we're handling that outside of a rate case. So I think staff's position really is, in historical test years, we didn't really do anything with state policy necessarily in base distribution rate cases, and in MRPs, we really shouldn't as well, because it's not exactly the place to handle those topics.
Well, and yet you were here yesterday and you heard the utilities present that as one of the key values of MYP as opposed to a traditional rate case. So what you're saying is that has no place in a rate case?
Not necessarily no place, but it isn't the appropriate avenue to address new policy. The battery storage is a separate case. All these new, proposals and initiatives that come out of the legislature typically have their own cases, have their own proceedings. We just don't think it should be lumped in with a base rate case, because obviously, as we've discussed in our comments and other parties have discussed, there's a lot to already review with projects and things like that. Our accountants and engineers already have plenty to look over.
Okay,
So when you're including new
PIMs have no place in an MYP?
I would think of that as something slightly different. You could have PIMs to try and maybe incentivize some state policy. So are you referring to PIM as a state policy in and of itself, or to enhance state policy?
Well, my understanding was that PIMs was a vehicle for helping to promote state policy.
Sure, they can be. Obviously, we have not had any approved as of yet. I believe BGE and PEPCO had PIMs for, just say, electric vehicle adoption by their own company and things like that.
Okay, so this is the position of staff, is that that promoting state policy doesn't really have a place in a rate case?
Again, it's not the place to introduce them and come up with new policies. You can come up with programs maybe to enhance them and ensure that they occur, but throwing in all new projects like we had with the Climate Solutions Now initiatives, we don't think is necessarily the time or place.
Okay.
Commissioner, I would also say that the multi-year rate plan process could be a way of controlling the implementation of programs that promote state policies, but multi-year rate plans aren't really a good vehicle for deciding new initiatives or new state policies to be implemented. That really requires
Okay, because that was one of the points that the utilities were making, is that you can't really effectively do state policy using a historical test year, and that was one of the values of MYP. And you're saying that this is really not a place to be promoting.
It's not a place based upon the MRPs that we've had. When the utility suggests a new initiative, maybe through a PIM, we've tended to request that they be considered in outside cases from the rate case.
Okay.
But the rate case itself, once you have established what's going to be done is a good way of controlling how it's done.
Okay, thank you. So on page 5, sort of the middle of the first paragraph, there's a statement, unlike the standard rate proceeding, the MRP process, it's like MYP, MRP, I'm getting confused, but the MRP process in practice has resulted in customers having rate increases over each of the rate effective periods. Can you expand on that a little? So, I mean, that was, you know, we'd hoped to sort of, are you saying that had we used a standard rate proceeding, we wouldn't be experiencing the kinds of rate increases that we're seeing under an MRP?
No.
So-
Okay.
Under, go
I
ahead.
can take- so it's just saying you're getting so under the traditional historical test year rate case, you just get the one increase. It could be quite large, but you're just getting the one. So this is just saying, under an MRP, you're getting 3 consecutive years of rate increases. So if the utility doesn't file a historical test year rate case for 2 or 3 years, obviously the rates
Okay,
are
but
locked.
then if you follow up on the next sentence, as such, the experience of customers may be that the MRP process results in more rate increases than traditional rate-making procedures. So can you explain what
Well-
that means then?
That's because the model reflects an increase to account for all the costs that they're seeing within each year of that period. So you're seeing increases on each and every year, whereas under a traditional case, it's the utility goes out, pays for all the cost, and then they'll come in and get a huge rate increase that pays for all the stuff that they have.
Although we have the ability to spread it out, or so I guess the question is, here it's 2024. If there had not been an MYP for BGE, and instead for the last couple of years BGE had gone under a traditional rate case, would we be seeing lower distribution costs or just distribution rates now?
I don't
So-
think, I don't think so.
And
All
that's
all you're doing is you're smoothing out, if you will, the cost over a period of time. If you had used an historic period, you may have in 22, you may have had $125, $140 million rate increase, and then you may go 2 or 3 years without a rate increase.
okay, but then I guess the language of this sentence seems to suggest to me that you get more rate increases under MRP than you do under traditional.
Well, that is true for the most part, because under a traditional rate case, normally it's just one increase in rates, and it stays fixed for a while. Under an MRP, as implemented, there's rate increases every year for that's what the customer sees, a rate increase every year.
Okay, so it could be that so what the sentence is saying is that you might have less rate increases, but you might not. Is that what you're sort of?
Well, I think under historic, they're going to be quite large. And what you're seeing under a forecasted model is you're going to pay the same level of cost. It just, you may pay $40 million each year rather than $100 million in year one.
That's assuming we have as much control over. I mean, we've talked yesterday about the fact that utilities spend money because they've been allowed to, and it gives us less ability to be able to rein in costs. So in that circumstance, we will see higher rates under an MRP, just because we have less ability to review what is being presented. At least that had been some of the discussion yesterday.
Well,
You don't think that that's?
Are you referring to prudence?
Yeah, well, yes. And so I guess the question is, do we have as much ability to control the costs of spend in an MRP than we do under a historical test year?
Well, I think under historic model, the utility goes out, pays for everything, and then comes in. And so you're tasked with conducting prudence on something that has already happened. Now, certainly that's going to happen under the forecast model as well. That company implements a budget, they close projects, they get moved into rate base. Now, as they move into rate base, you're going to conduct a prudence of all those projects that are moved into rate base.
So you think we have the same amount of control in either scenario?
I think you actually have more control because right now under the model, you have two reconciliations under the model. You're doing a reconciliation of year one and year two, and then you're going to have a final reconciliation. Both of those are going to give you an opportunity to review the assets that are moved into rate base. Do we agree with them? Do we believe
Okay,
that?
so change reconciliation to prudence, is that what you're talking about? Are you talking about two opportunities to do a prudence review?
Well, certainly anytime an asset is moved into rate base, that offers an opportunity to review the asset.
Right,
terms.
that's the second, but what I'm talking about the first. You said that there are two opportunities to review.
Well, you only get one opportunity to review an asset once it gets moved into rate base. What I'm saying is, under the current model, there are two reconciliations. There's a reconciliation after year two, and then there's a secondary reconciliation for all costs that aren't reviewed, typically after year three. So you only get to do prudence one time, but there are essentially two prudency evaluations. And
Yeah, this is where I'm sorry,
It's-
this is
but-
where I
but-
start to
but
struggle.
you're not reviewing the assets twice. When I say there's
No, but I don't know what I'm doing in that first review. Is that prudence? I mean, I keep coming back to, I'm struggling with what our review means in that first instance during reconciliation. Is that a prudency review?
well, yes, when the assets are moved into rate base.
No,
that-
before the assets are moved into rate base.
Are you talking about the commission's initial order that is essentially approving or setting forth the budgets that are going to be built into rates? That's not a prudency determination.
Can I say something?
Please.
So there's, I think I've followed yesterday's discussion. My take on it is there's supposed to be two reviews. The first one is when the MRPs are filed, are the projects good? Are they net beneficial to customers? So there would be costs associated with the projects. What are the projects supposed to do to benefit customers? So it's really not a prudency review, but kind of an aspect of a prudency review, because we've decided on projects not to go forward after the initial review of the project. So ideally, we could do that initially to determine what projects go
Except
to
the
rate base.
projects change. See, and that's the
Correct.
other problem is that, even if this is, prudence light, it's
Right.
it's prudence based on projects that may or may not go forward and change.
Right.
And so then what does that mean?
Right. So that's one of the challenges that we have identified. Mid review, there are new projects introduced, and that's one of the challenges that staff has identified. But then there's the other aspect of the prudency review, that is the execution part. Has the cost been within reasonable variance as as proposed of 10-15% plus minus, or were there is the scope expanded? Then if the scope is expanded, I think there was a lot of discussion with OPC about the planned pole replacements. There are new, I think, they bundled up different programs, and they indicated that there would be beneficial operation and management cost benefits. Then include what those benefits are. So that would be I think there's a lot of moving parts, and that's one of the things that we're struggling
Yeah,
with.
and I'm struggling with those parts too. Continuing on page 5, in the first bullet, the second sentence, the MRP format transfers more risk from the utility to customers. So who would like to expand on that? Because that was talked about yesterday as well.
More risk in that the company is proposing a discrete set of projects for a 3-year period. Those get quantified into rates, and then as you look at the reconciliation, which is a review of budget to actual, your projects have changed from the initial projects that were put forward. So from that point, I look at it as more risky. You still have the same set of conclusions to come to. Is it a reasonable and efficient level of spend?
But we talked a little bit about the fact that because we have reconciliation, there's less risk to the utility when it is looking forward. On some level, it kind of takes away the risk completely, because you can always get back what you spend if you underestimate what the spend is.
Well, that's true, but there's also the asymmetric nature of that, in that if it goes the other way, ratepayers are paid back with interest.
Has that happened
Yes.
here in
Delmarva
Okay.
over-recovered and paid that back.
Okay.
I think they're paying that back presently.
Right. But not BGE?
Now,
Okay. So going to page 6, you spoke with Commissioner Richard about having better support for spending plans. And do you have any idea how that can be accomplished? I mean, they sort of give this proposal of spending plans, but as we know, they've changed. They change, and then sometimes there are new projects that you hadn't seen before. So, is there a way, if we were to keep the MYP model, it's with 3 years, what do you have suggestions on how we can better manage that?
I think the first thing is a requirement that the utility, number one, has to provide detailed testimony that demonstrates that their spending is both reasonable and efficient.
At the outset, so that's not just a wish list; that it actually has
No,
support.
during the reconciliation.
Okay, but I'm talking about initially.
Well, the initial projects are simply a guide to develop rates. It's not until you get to the reconciliation where prudence becomes a fundamental question.
Okay, tell me about what you mean by a guide to developing rates. Do they have meaning?
Well, they have meaning in that those projects, those costs, are formulated into a revenue requirement. That revenue requirement is generated into rates. When you come to the reconciliation, you're comparing.
Okay, but stop there. When utilities proposing a list of projects, does that have meaning other than trying to formulate a revenue requirement? I mean, does it are those projects supposed to be projects that the utility intends to put into place?
Well, the idea is the company puts forward a budget for 3 years, and then prior to rates at the beginning of each period, there's a project list which governs what they plan to spend on during that year. Now, the project list is their best effort, if you will, as to what spend spend is going to be during that period. Now, there's always going to be changes.
Right, but I'm asking, is there something that we can do to make their forecast better, or at least have there be consequences if they change it out? I mean, we had, they had the earnings sharing mechanism as a way to sort of be penalized if they don't get their ROR right. I mean, is there a way to build into the initial project list? I mean, the OPC referred to it as a wish list. I mean, can we do something that makes it have consequences more than it does right now?
So I just wanted to speak to, can you hear me okay, first
Yes,
of all?
I can hear you fine.
Okay. To to the first part of your question, and I will leave the consequences piece to the others. But what can the companies do? I think they should provide better quantitative benefits information, and we've been drilling this for the past couple of years,
Okay.
because we want to see whether the proposed projects have been vetted very well. They are net beneficial. They're better than the alternatives. So I think, there's been limited benefits information associated with the cost. There's been sufficient cost information. I think we would like to see that upfront in the filings before they go to, rates. We would like to have the opportunity to review the projects, determine they're good projects to move forward. So
Okay,
I
with-
would
with
say that.
less requirement on your end to submit data requests.
Correct.
So that the data actually comes, and we had talked about this question about, who actually who bears the risk, because a lot of it's been shifting to you to provide the necessary data requests. So you'd like to have some better parameters for what's being submitted in the initial filing.
Correct.
And in addition, at the point of reconciliation is not just an accounting exercise. It should be also have testimony as to the benefits.
Right,
Right,
beyond
right.
variance. So it's not just about whether you met costs, but whether you did all the things you needed to do to put this in place.
And in addition, it needs to identify the changes that have been made.
Okay. So, you looked at you had a chance to look at the equitable earnings risk sharing mechanism, which I don't know why that wasn't put into the initial comments of the utilities, because the challenge for the parties was that they really didn't get a chance to provide comment on the mechanism until they actually came to the table. And we didn't see this until it was put into the reply comments. And so I don't think that the process benefits from that. And I'm assuming that you didn't come up with this at the last moment. So I'm just sort of saying, for the utilities, we would have benefited from a written analysis of the proposal. So that's just, but so the proposal is to have to look to see whether the utilities are meeting their ROR after we've allowed them this amount of money to spend,
Yeah.
200 million, and then maybe what? Okay, so in looking at whether they're meeting their ROR, they are earning on monies that we're allowing them to spend without having done a prudency review. Am I getting that right, or?
The prudency review is done at the time of the reconciliation. So this mechanism that they put forward would kind of it would move in place of that mechanism.
It would move in place of
The-
the
the-
prudency
No,
mechanism.
no, no. It's not going to replace prudency. Right
Right.
now, what happens is the reconciliation details, here's my budget, here's my actual, here's the differences of the closed projects, and you develop a revenue requirement on that. This would say that you develop a dead band, and if there's whatever the delta is, it's going to be shared. Assuming there's, exogenous costs and so forth.
Right. But this will happen with monies that we're authorizing them to spend before prudency determination has been made about whether these were the right spends. Is that
Yeah, these would be the spend you approved during the initial application.
right? So they'd be earning a return on those.
Yeah, I mean that's they'd have to be. Yeah, so you would have set the rate of return, just say at 7% when BG filed their second MYP, and then that's what
Right,
the
so
dead band would
just
apply
to be clear, we're allowing them to earn a return on monies that we've not determined have been spent in a prudent manner.
But
I think that's a fair state, but you would have reviewed, this would have happened in the initial application, though. You would have
Yes,
reviewed these
but
projects in the budget.
But is that a prudency review? And that is, again, this is where I'm still struggling with.
Sure.
But no, that's what happens during the reconciliation. That's when all forms of prudency take place.
Right.
It can't happen initially. Initially, this is the utilities' take on what they're going to spend based on a whole variety of items.
But,
And
but
it's at the end of the period when you evaluate whether that spending is actually reasonable.
yes, but some of the spending obviously has been rejected in the initial application. You've done that previously.
Right, but last week we had a whole list of projects that they're not in
They
the
weren't closed and moved into rate base. So
Right.
you didn't,
So-
you didn't conduct prudency on those
right.
projects.
But this was the third reconciliation. When are we going to do prudency review on that? But they're spending money right on those projects now.
They are, but they're not in service yet, so even though they've spent money on it, it's not included in customers' rates, it doesn't go into.
Right,
debt
right, but
service.
I'm looking at this mechanism, and I'm asking, under the mechanism that was proposed by the utilities, would they be earning a return on monies that they're spending for projects that we've not approved?
No.
This mechanism would only take place as part of the reconciliations. That's when they would know if they're over-earning or under-earning. This wouldn't be done at the beginning of the MRP. This would be done at the reconciliation process.
At a reconciliation
Yes.
project
Right, yeah.
process. So this would be after the third, or after the second.
Correct.
Okay, but for the monies that we're authorizing that they spend, they're not earning on that.
You give them, say, $100 million, and
Right.
that's built dependent on a certain level of capital and a certain level of O&M. All that is generated into rates. You're not setting out that Project A, Project B, Project C are the best projects or the prudent projects or the spend is reasonable. That happens at a later date. You're simply providing a mechanism that provides cash
Right,
flow.
but increases in rates for monies that were allocated for MYP, even if the project has not gone into rate base, if the rates are increasing, they're increasing based on spending we're allowing without a prudency determination.
I'm sorry, I missed your question, Commissioner.
Okay. I have to remember the question. So rates are going up, correct?
Potentially.
And they're going up based on spend. that we've authorized. And so those rates are going up based on spend that we have not determined is prudent.
That's correct,
yes.
that's forecasted rates.
Yes.
Right, but to go into that, so as they're spending it, it doesn't automatically earn a return.
Okay.
It doesn't start earning a return until, like I said before, that it goes into service.
Okay, so
once
that's
the
not
plant-
going to that's not going to impact their ROE, but it is going to affect rates. So customers are going to be paying increased rates based on monies we've authorized for spending, but we've not made a prudency determination.
Yeah.
Okay.
They eventually will, once it goes into plant service, but not until then.
That's for the return part. But I'm talking about we're seeing increased rates for customers from the initial 200 million authorization, and then we had a 75 million authorization. Now we've got 150 million proposal. That's all based on numbers, dollars that we've not determined are prudent.
Yes, that's correct.
That's right.
Okay, but they are resulting in increased rates for customers.
Yes.
Sure.
Okay, so that's what I'm asking is okay. And then what happens if we were to make a determination that all of that spend was imprudent, all $400 million?
Then all of that would be removed.
We'd claw that back?
Well, you're not clawing it back. It's not in rate base yet.
No, but what happens to the rates that the customers are paying?
Yeah, it was based on forecasted budget.
Because remember, the budget is simply a forecast. It's
No, I'm talking about,
We find it's imprudent, what do we do then?
well at that time. So you're at the reconciliation, and you say Project A is deemed unreasonable. We're going to disallow, $10 million. That $10 million isn't in rate base.
no, but the rates that customers pay were based on the approval of that money. What's going to happen to those rates? I guess they go down? And what happens to the money that the customer pays the utility for a project that we ultimately deem as imprudent? Do we claw that back?
So you're essentially saying, would you claw back the return on a certain level of investment?
No, I'm saying, do we claw back if a customer's paying,
Yeah.
$5 and then they're paying now $6 because we have authorized the 200 million and then 75 million, and then we determined that all of that was imprudent because we hadn't done a prudency determination. Those ratepayers had been paying money based on an assumption that we were going to find a project prudent, and then we found it imprudent. What do we do with that? Do we tell the utility, pay the customer that dollar back?
Well, I think
Make them out through the reconciliation.
if when you're in the reconciliation, if you said the entire portfolio of assets, let's look at it from a disastrous point of view. $200 million, their entire portfolio. We deem all of that inefficient, and we're going to disallow everything.
Right.
They would lose that 200 million. Now, certainly, I guess your question is, what about the carrying charge during the year that customers were paying? Certainly, I think, I hadn't thought about that, but I think you could move into that vehicle as well. But the chances of a complete disarray of the entire portfolio is
But my point is that we have customers paying now increased rates for spend that we have not deemed prudent. And that's the concern I have with it, MYP. So
but-
that's what I'm actually asking, if there's a way that we
but
can.
customers are not paying for projects that have not been moved into rates, into plant. So remember last week we had a discussion. There was approximately 46 million of projects of year 3 that were incomplete. Customers are not paying for those projects
Okay.
because they haven't been moved in.
Let's start with the first year that we approved the 200 million spend. Did anything happen to customers' rates?
Did anything? Well,
Residential customers, did their distribution rate go up?
certainly.
Okay.
It's gonna go up based on the revenue requirement associated with.
That's what I'm saying. So their rates went up for a spend where we made no prudency determination.
So I think in your hypothetical, if all of the spend was rejected, it should come through the reconciliation, because if you remove that spend, the utility's rate of return should go up.
But what happens to
So if the rate of return goes above what you authorized, then they have to return it to the
okay,
customer.
but for the ratepayers that had been paying too much for their distribution charge, because the charge was based on the 200 million, what happens to that?
You would have that rider with the reconciliation. They'd have to credit customers.
Right, and
Okay.
it would be.
Because just all else being equal, if you take out their spend, their rate of return goes up. So, we have the reconciliation. It can be up or down, as we noted. DPL's giving money back to customers. So if you remove that spend, all else being equal, the rate of return would go above what, just say they were authorized, then they'd have to return that amount to customers.
And that would include carrying costs, so it not be just what they were paid, that they would get interest on all that.
Okay.
So just say they overspent and their rate of return looked low because, you thought their spending was imprudent, they overspend, and you take all that out. It could go back above the rate of return, so then they have to credit that to customers with interest.
Okay. Well, I think that's all I have. Thank you.
Okay. Commissioner Barbe.
Thank you. I'll try not to make this into a filibuster. So, reading your testimony, it seemed to me pretty clear that you said the administrative burden was higher under an MYP than it would have been for a historical test year, correct?
Yes.
Yes, if you're saying one historical test year versus one multi-year rate plan, yes, the multi-year rate plan has more work.
The way to look at it is a forecasted under the MRP. It's an ongoing exercise. You're reviewing project lists. You're doing a reconciliation year by year by year. Under a traditional, you're evaluating the units, the costs, and so forth. You build a revenue requirement, and it's done.
But what we're not saying is that if we had maintained the standard rate making process for all the companies, we're not saying that the workload would have been lower because there might have been multiple rate cases for each company.
Okay, let me restate the question this way. So, let's try and compare apples to apples. A 3-year multi-year rate plan versus 3 individual historic test years, which one has a greater administrative burden?
It's hard to say, but if you have the 3 historical test years every year, I think it could be argued that would be a bigger administrative burden, but again, it's hard to say.
Well, I mean, your testimony made it appear that the administrative burden is higher under an MYP, and now you're saying something that is at variance with that. Did I
But
misread your...
No, so that's what I was saying. 1-to-1, an MRP has more work than a historical test year.
One historical test year?
Yes. Like, if BGE, for example, filed a historic test year versus an MRP, the historical test year has less administrative burden. But if BGE, PEPCO, and DPL file every year an historical test year instead of 3 MRPs in 3 different years, it's hard to say. But the administrative burden could possibly be higher with 3 historical test years each year.
Okay. That gets rid of my second question, where I was going to ask you if it was worth it. Apparently, you haven't really evaluated which one has more of an administrative burden,
I mean,
comparatively speaking.
I think in terms of, you're comparing 1 year worth of projects, at least for engineering, to 3 years, combined. in terms of the workload is going to be more for the MYP, just simply because of how many projects you're looking at
Okay.
and having to do a prudency for that many number of projects.
All right, let me go on to another topic, and that's the whole issue of prudency, which until 45 minutes ago I thought I understood. So let me give you an example of the life cycle of a project. Let's say BG&E decides to build a substation, and then they start spending money. And when the substation is constructed and ready to be used and useful, then at the end of that process, it is constructed, it is ready to be used and useful. Now, during this process, what I seem to have heard is that at the very beginning, there's an assessment of whether or not it ought to be built, and then the money is spent, and then it becomes used and useful. At what point does prudency take place?
During the reconciliation.
No. At what point in the life cycle of that substation does the prudency take
Prudency
place?
can only happen once the asset is finished and moved into plant and service.
Okay. So really, it's wrong to say that the starting point of where the substation is contemplated and planned for, that's not prudency.
Well,
No. It's-
I'm an accountant. I like cutoffs.
in terms of the
Are you talking about the initial, when you're looking at an
Yeah.
initial project list? That's not prudence.
Okay, because somebody, I don't know who, sort of testified to something slightly different from that. So, okay, just before it's it's available to be used and useful, it is only at that point that prudency would take place. Okay, now in a historic test year, this would happen on an ongoing annual basis, but in an MYP, it occurs during reconciliation?
That's right.
Okay, well, that's cleared up.
Can I supplement?
Oh,
think I
please.
probably was the one that said that.
No, I don't think you were, but go
Okay,
ahead.
good. I feel better now. I think there should be I think the company should make a justification as to why that substation is needed in the first place when they filed the MRP. So is there like a load growth that necessitated the company to build that substation? That case should be made first. So, and then
Okay.
we can talk, in the reconciliation, we can talk about was the cost, was the execution of the project consistent or reasonable with
Okay,
the plan.
but that's not, I totally agree with you, but that's not to be confused with prudency.
Yeah, but also in the context of the pipeline project, we have to make a determination whether or not it's an eligible infrastructure replacement.
Okay,
So,
agreed, but that's not prudency.
No.
Okay, good. I'm unconfused on that point.
I guess I don't know. Maybe there should be some, I think, clarification on about what prudency is. I think the whole MRP concept confuses everything. So when you're saying this is probably the load growth did not really necessitate a substation build out. What are you saying? So is that I wouldn't call it a prudent. I don't know what that is called, but that should happen. So the wording, I don't know what that is, but the reconciliation, the whole prudence concept should come with used and useful. So that's when the execution would be studied. But I think in the MRP concept, the need for the project should be looked at the onset of the MRP.
Is it not in a historic test year?
No.
You wouldn't know about it.
You wouldn't know about what they're building until you come in for a rate case.
Okay. Let's talk about burden of proof a bit. So, and listening to the people who oppose MYPs and listening to some of the commentary and having read your testimony, it's come to my notice that apparently under MYPs there is a greater burden for staff to seek out data. Is that true?
yes.
I would-
More than under a historic test year?
Well, I think under the forecast model, prudency becomes a bigger question than under an historic model, because you're pre-funding. You're not doing that under an historic model.
Okay.
And so therefore, prudency becomes a bigger question. Why did you do this? Did you spend reasonably? All those questions come in to bear because you're looking outward.
Okay, and therefore, there is a greater burden upon staff to ask for data than there would be under a historic test year model?
There's a greater degree under the model as presently constructed because currently there's no data put forward by the utilities in defense of what they've spent. Is it reasonable? Is it efficient? Did we do a good job? So that means the other parties therefore have to go forward and say, they spent this, how is it reasonable? So it transfers the risk of that spend to the other parties.
Okay, so just to put it into the record, the answer is yes, it puts greater burden upon staff to request data.
Yes.
Okay. Let's talk a little bit about public policy because I was a little astonished by an answer with respect to the use of a rate case to pursue state public policy. I have to say, I agree that the primary function of the commission in a rate case is rates. I agree with that. But would you at least be able to say that a secondary objective of the commission is to uphold public policy when we're doing all of our work, including rate cases?
Yes.
Yeah, but that doesn't mean the rate case needs to introduce new public policies. That, like we were saying, it's not the best place, we don't believe, to put out the new, innovate new public policies. Like I was saying, we don't want the rate case to inhibit public policy, but to use the rate case to throw in, I don't remember how much it was, $300, $400, $500 million worth of these Climate Solutions Now programs, we don't think is the time or place.
But I would say you could certainly do it, but it makes the proceeding that much more contentious.
Yeah. And with historical test years, there's no reason why you couldn't still advance state policy. I'm also confused by those responses. You have a proceeding to initiate whatever this new legislative mandate is, and then the utilities know they can build it. So in a historical test year, they don't have to worry about prudency and things like that because, hey, we were told we have to spend this money, then we show up the next year with our increased rate base.
So,
I mean,
go ahead.
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Oh, I was going to add. Now I've lost my.
So for
Sorry.
EVs, obviously I'm very close to the EV process. We had regulatory assets and things like that. They can put it in there, could earn a return, a slight return, and then they come in for the rate case and move it into rate base. It's the MRP doesn't necessarily make it easier to implement state policy, I would argue. Now we get a little more insight into their planning. The engineers can speak more to that. But again, we were talking about the administrative burden. It's already pretty high. Then if you're going to throw in all these new proposals for new initiatives, there's even more DRs and more staff time that needs to go to that as well.
Okay, but that's not an MYP versus a historic rate. It would be the same in both scenarios.
Sure. Yeah.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
The other thing is that whether a traditional rate case or an MRP, there's time limits for the whole procedure. So and because of that, we would not want to accelerate the review of any new initiatives to implement state policies.
Let me come at this from a slightly different angle. Many years ago, I was involved in rewriting the electronic commerce laws in the state, and the people who were opposed to it were saying, no, you need to be very strict about this, 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 and this. And the people who were in favor of that law said, yeah, but you have to pass the law. You have to be... The situation around us has to inform your decision, which is a very hazy way of saying you have to take more into account than just what's on the piece of paper. So let me ask the question this way. As commissioners doing a rate case, should we be informed of what state policy is in the back of our heads as we're making these decisions?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, and in our presentation, we noted that the utility should list for their projects what they're intended to accomplish.
Okay.
And that was including the state policies that it implements.
Okay.
And can I add something?
please.
So I think there was a lot of discussion about yesterday about distribution system planning yesterday, and I think one other thing the commissioners should take into account is ideally would be a very stakeholder engaged process in the distribution system planning process. So one thing the commissioner should look at is whether the proposed projects and investments are consistent with whatever was proposed and approved or reviewed in the distribution system planning, because that's where I think plans would be introduced that would advance state policy goals. So that's another consideration, I guess.
Oh, thank you. So the utility and the people who support multi-year rate plans have made a point of saying that it's like driving your car while looking only in the rearview mirror. I'm not sure I agree with that analogy, but if we were to say no more MYPs, only historic rate cases, is there anything that precludes us for asking for plans for investment in the future?
Under a traditional,
Yeah.
no, you're free to implement any guideline that you want. You have to spend under these categories, if you will.
Okay.
Sorry.
Okay. I mean, for me, this entire, I'll just complete my thoughts here, Mr. Chairman, by saying that for me, this has been an exercise in determining whether, I was going to say the additional work, but apparently maybe there's not additional work, whether the change to an MYP, whether there's a value add compared to traditional rate making or compared to traditional rate making plus a requirement for an investigation of future plans for investments and policies. And so, yep, your questions have been, your answers have been very useful to me in trying to decide whether there is a value added to having MYPs. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. So returning to this issue about state policy goals, when I read the order that started this down this path that came out in August of 2019, there's a number of references at the end of the order where they're implementing this process, referring to the fact that one of the goals that the commission, now only one person, sitting up here was here then, but it seems pretty clear that the commission saw this process as a way of achieving state goals. And so I guess what I'm hearing from you is that should be, and in fact, it seemed to be part and parcel of why they thought they should go forward with this. It seemed to, when you read the order, it's clear that they saw the advantages that the utility would get from this, but it seemed, reading between the lines, that there was some hesitancy about whether or not this was a good deal for everybody else. And one of the ways they got there was to say, well, one of the benefits will be, we'll get these implementation of state goals, and some of them are, fairly closely related to the energy business, further electrification, renewable energy development, and items like that. So, but what I'm hearing from you is that's not part of the that shouldn't be part of the process.
What we've found in practice is that the multi-year rate plan, just the schedule in the case, and the administrative burden of working on the case itself, tends to require that any of these initiatives to promote state policies be requested to be considered separately.
Yeah.
It's just that in practice, giving our staffing and everything, our limited resources, it's just too hard to do everything at one time.
Yeah. And I think many of us at this table were part of the work group when we developed them, the MYP MRPs back then as well. It's just, as Samry was noting, it still is best, particularly electrification. That's a huge issue, a huge topic. You'd want to have a work group or multiple stakeholders or discussions how all the utilities should move forward. If these things are done in a rate case, you get each utility following their own things. All the stakeholders may not be aware. It just becomes kind of haphazard with how they implement these large state policy goals. So that's why I was saying, we obviously don't ignore state policy goals, and we don't want the rate cases to inhibit state policy goals, but to introduce new large programs and have them be completely different by the various utilities, we don't think is practical.
Okay, and in reading your comments, there's a lot of concern raised about the burden on staff and the parties to try to deal with the information situation regarding the reconciliation. There's a lot of comments about the fact of things that you don't think the multi-year rate plans have accomplished. But the bottom line is you still want us to keep this process, correct?
We didn't recommend that you eliminate multi-year rate plans. We didn't come to that conclusion.
Okay. I mean, is there a reason why?
I think it's better to enhance what you already have, primarily around the issue of prudence. Once you solve the issue of prudence, I think that goes a long way with making the model much better.
Okay.
There are also benefits because we do get an understanding of what the companies are doing in various programs, and we have input into what they're doing ahead of time.
And this sharing mechanism that Commissioner Suchman discussed when she was asking questions that was brought up yesterday, I mean, is it your view that that's an improvement to the process? And I'm not saying take it just the way they pitched it, but I'm talking more as a concept. Is that a major improvement to this process?
I think it can be. Yeah, and I would argue it also doesn't have to be symmetrical. Obviously, the utilities wouldn't like to hear that, but you could have, the band was 25 basis points below the rate of return, 25 above. You could do 25 below and 10 above, or none of, you can't go above your rate of return, or if they go above the rate of return, they have to give 75% back to customers instead of the 50. So yeah, we think it's a reasonable way to limit some of obviously the reconciliation. There was a lot of concerns about that. We think that, this can be worked with. I'll just say that it can be, the specifics can be worked out, and it could be helpful.
Okay. And then on one of your earlier slides, you talked about the utility should apply to have this. No, keep.
That was near the front where it says recommendations. On
Yeah, it was before the filing requirements.
Is the notice requirement that you're referring to?
Yeah, we asked for 6 months.
Essentially, what I remember the slide saying was that the utility would have to file for permission to use an MRP before they sort of used it. And I guess what I was trying to figure out is how's that different than the current situation?
Well, the pilot, the commission as pilot indicated that BGE was going to be the pilot utility, and we've ended up with BGE, Pepco,
Right.
and Delmarva as in the pilot. And staff just thinks that while we're still in the pilot phase, especially, that not every utility probably, well, I won't say that.
Yeah. It just
It just seems that the commission and other parties should be on notice that an MRP is coming up.
Yeah. Just for planning purposes, for staff resources. It's just helpful to know when they're coming in, because obviously we were kind of pancaked.
So they'd
with
almost have
Pepco.
to file like a pre-application before they filed the thing, or?
Not necessarily, just a notification, and we could maybe work with them to delay it by a month or file it a month earlier, just based on what else is going on. So because we were kind of pancaked with the PEPCO one, whereas 4 months I think after the BGE, their initial MYP. Obviously, we weren't terribly
But you're not
excited about that.
envisioning a situation where this is like a permission slip. Can we do this? This is more just, hey, we're going to do this.
Well, it certainly could be that.
Could be permanent.
Yeah.
But, it's a form of alternative rate making. The commission could require authorization to use the MRP. If you're unsure that the MRP provides all the benefits I'm not, I would just think it should be discretionary.
Okay. All right. I think that's everything I got. So thank you very much. So I got notification, I guess, that Exelon was looking to make a further comment. I guess I was trying to figure out exactly what it is you wanted to try and do. So if somebody from that team can come forward and sort of let us know what you had in mind. So.
Yep. Good morning. Mark Case for BGE. BGE and PHI would like a chance to respond to some of the concepts that were talked about yesterday, offer our perspective and offer some thoughts on process going forward. We noted that in the announcement of this proceeding, the agenda included maybe an hour at the end for more informal discussion or opportunities to respond to the positions put forward, and we would appreciate the opportunity to do that.
Okay, so I guess my thought is if we're going to do that, I actually would like the opportunity for maybe other people to respond to the suggestions you make. So I guess what my suggestion would be, bring forward whoever you want, and then everybody else who participated in this yesterday, bring somebody else up here too, and we'll literally just have, some cross communication, I guess, on this. So.
Yeah, Chair Hoover, Michael Sammartino on behalf of the Office of People's Counsel. Given that this is a legislative proceeding, all the parties have had an opportunity to put forth their opinions on the MRP. We think it would be more appropriate if the Commissioner has any further questions for parties. I think a Q&A is appropriate, but I think we would object to the Exelon Utilities having another opportunity to get the last word.
But what I'm proposing is that you'll get a chance to respond to their response. So.
As long as we have a chance to respond.
Oh yeah, don't worry, you will. So.
Thank you.
Sure. So, I guess for the utilities, go ahead and bring forward whoever you want, and then for the other parties, OPC, AOBA, yeah, if you're here, staff, and Mary Perg, yeah. So just everybody come forward, and we'll see how this works. So. Yeah. So, no, I told her to come. So.
Not MPERG.
No.
Mary Perg.
Yeah, it's actually going.
Okay.
Yes, sir. Yeah. We'll have everybody tell you who they are. So yeah. So.
Chairman, I think Mr. Lapp is probably going to come downstairs. If we could
All right, that's
wait
fine.
for just a couple
Sure.
minutes.
Okay.
Thank you.
Well, you want me to wait till he gets here, or?
If you want to, I think it's fine to go ahead if you
Okay.
want.
All right. Okay, so we'll start at this end, and then we'll literally go across here. So.
Okay, and I'll lead off sort of the joint positions of BG and PHI, and my colleagues can add to that as we go forward. But maybe just to summarize, what's been discussed and what we've heard over the day and a half of this proceeding. To begin with, we want to reiterate, unqualified, our strong support for MYPs as the form of alternative rate making allowed in Maryland. And I say that with some level of enhancements that parties agree makes sense. We continue to believe it best positions the utilities to make the investments which support state policy goals. And there's been discussion, is the initial rate case, MYP, whatever form, is that the place to introduce new policies? that could be debated, but even if it's not, it's certainly the place to continue the investment in state policies, even if it's not what launches it. So if there's a proceeding to discuss electrification and the kinds of programs to go forward there, or electric vehicle programs, or whatever it might be, at some point in time, the funding mechanism to continue those and the place to evaluate what level of progress are utilities making, what level of investment are they putting into those state policy goals, I would submit rate cases continue to be the right forum for that. It does allow us as utilities to look forward, to put forward our plans, and for parties to have that opportunity to align on the investment plans. We put forward 2 MYPs now. The commission has made adjustments to both of those. Parties have had, thousands, if not tens of thousands of pages of testimony, 4,000 discovery requests typically in an MYP case. There's a lot of information flowing back and forth. At the end of that, we come out with some sort of plan that the commission determines is in the public interest. I also think it's important that it keeps Maryland aligned with the majority of states across the country that have determined there's a need for a shift away from historic-looking test years and single-year planning to a framework that is more forward-looking and that does span more than a single year. I think sustaining MYPs in some fashion, it's an important signal. It keeps Maryland from making what we would view as a regressive direction in terms of rate making. And I think, it just, if we go back to the past, it clearly in our minds makes it more difficult for the utilities to be able to make the investments that are good for our customers, that are aligned to state policy objectives. So that's sort of the threshold, reiterating our support for multi-year plans. And then maybe to focus on the enhancements, as a threshold matter, we stand behind the suggested improvements that Mr. Frayne and Mr. Lemming spoke about yesterday in terms of information flow. We heard from staff in their presentation. What felt to me like similar types of enhancements, but it feels as though there's the opportunity to align on those things and to implement them in the near term. So then, I go next to the reconciliation process and the potential for an earnings and risk-sharing mechanism. From some of the commissioner questions and discussion yesterday, there seemed to be an interest in limiting the amount of factors that would be considered exogenous factors, largely outside the control of a utility. We're generally supportive of that. So we're not looking, today we reconcile virtually everything except for maybe the cost of debt. There's one item that isn't, and there's 1,000 items that are reconciled. I think going forward, it seems to us there are probably 2 primary things that should be part of an ongoing reconciliation. And the first would be storms. We know from history storms are sudden, they're expensive. We're focused on doing everything we can to accelerate the recovery time from a storm, bringing in mutual assistance when it makes sense. And I think you all and we would want the utilities to be, financially positioned to be able to go forward with that. So storms would be item 1 on the 2-item list that we recommend for exogenous factors for reconciliation. And I think in doing that, we should also go back to what we did up through 2020, and we stopped it in 2021, which was including an average cost for storms based on history. We used a trailing 5-year average for, at least a decade, maybe much longer than that. And somehow with MYPs, we got to a zero budgeting approach. And that just sets up the reconciliation to kind of go in one direction, right? Because the likely outcome is not zero, but that's what we're using. So as part of this, we would propose to go back to using a historic trailing 5-year average as a proxy for what storm costs are. And then it sets up the reconciliation on that to be 50-50. It could be a credit or refund to customers, or if we had a heavy storm period, it could be an increase. But it sort of like takes reconciliations from just being the utilities asking for more money. Now we've got a reasonable budget to work with, and then if it's higher or lower than that, that differential would flow back to customers. The second item is around new business. And, from a materiality standpoint, probably historically, new business variations aren't as significant as some other variations that we might experience. But as we think about proliferation of data centers, there can be really expensive costs for new business. Now, some of those may be in the transmission space and not in the distribution space, but we've seen examples of both. And then as we think about state policies driven towards electrification and fuel switching, and probably the need to do service reinforcements to homes to accommodate the greater electric demand, it seems to us that new business is probably subject to more variation going forward than what we've seen historically. So those would be sort of the two major defined areas for reconciliation. Everything else, with one caveat that I'm about to speak to, would flow through the earnings sharing mechanism, if you will. So a lot of discussion this morning and a little bit yesterday about sometimes for implementing new policy objectives, the commission will convene a specific proceeding just focused on that. So it could be EV programs in phase 2. It could be the Warmth Act, where BG's already provided notice we're going to be coming in next June with 1 or 2 pilot projects to propose for network geothermal. It could be the Drive Act, where we're obligated to come in with several new pilots by July 1 of next year. So in those proceedings, in addition to the commission evaluating whether the proposal should go forward or not, we would suggest that that should also include the recovery approach. And to do that would mean a regulatory asset. So you approve a network geothermal project, you approve a Drive Act pilot program, you approve a new suite of EV programs, create the funding for that, which would be in the form of a regulatory asset. So those are sort of the thoughts on that reconciliation mechanism. The other thing we wanted to respond to, I think, Commissioner Suchman, you kind of talked about the fact that you don't like doing these frequent reconciliations, like we do a case and then let's not see you again for 3 more years, paraphrasing a little bit. But we understand that, and so our thought on the reconciliation, the limited reconciliation, and then the earnings sharing mechanism, if we have a 3-year MYP, instead of doing it year 1, reconciliation and earnings sharing, year 2, reconciliation and earnings sharing, same thing for year 3, we aggregate the 3 years. And at the end of that, maybe year 1, the utility under-recovered, maybe year 2, it over-recovered, maybe year 3 was pretty close to the target, but you aggregate it. I think administratively it makes it easier to manage. It's certainly fewer proceedings, so we have 1 proceeding. And so in a hypothetical MYP, you'd have year 1, year 2, year 3, and then in year 4, in the early part of year 4, the utility would file for that aggregated reconciliation and the aggregated earnings sharing mechanism that reflected the full 3 years that had just transpired. There's also been some mention, we heard Mr. McAuliffe most recently, and I think it came up yesterday as well, that it doesn't necessarily need to be a symmetrical mechanism. And there's mention, I think, of Massachusetts as at least one state that doesn't do it that way. We would acknowledge there are different ways to set this up. We would just say at the end of the day, it should be balanced. If a state didn't have, for example, any sharing of the risks, in other words, if utilities' costs exceeded its forecast and that state said, that's on you, you don't get any recovery of that, well, typically then that same state would have a much higher deadband that would be in place before the sharing of savings in the opposite direction would take place. So, we can articulate this in whatever process of briefs we employ, but as a sort of a conceptual matter, I wanted to put that forward. Next, I wanted to sort of shift gears and talk about the discussion of single-year rate cases. Categorically, we oppose that. Historic is the absolute worst. Forward-looking is less worse, but they're both bad. It leaves us as being in the position of needing to file pancaked rate cases. For example, we would adjudicate for 10 months. Even if it's forward-looking, it's considered alternative rate making, requires a 10-month proceeding, go through a 10-month proceeding. 60 days later, we're filing the next one. And it's just, we've been in that position before. There was clear what was called rate case fatigue, and we see it coming back again. We also know that just with the Exelon family of companies, BGE, Pepco, and Delmarva, our cases would be simultaneous. They would be overlapping. It would be sort of a perpetual thing. But beyond just sort of that administrative aspect and the rate case fatigue and the customer fatigue that would take place, so much of our planning is done on a multi-year basis. There was a lot of talk about distribution system planning and the new process that's going to unfold there. That's being done on a 3-year cycle. There was talk yesterday, I think, from OPC about integrating DSP and MYP. So DSPs are on a 3-year cycle. Empower is on a 3-year cycle. Reliability planning is on a 4-year cycle. So to set up our rate cases for a 1-year cycle, incongruent, we believe, with the way that we're planning, the way that we're implementing initiatives that span multiple years, incongruent with how we're sourcing our contractor resources, where we want to give them the assurance of stable work for more than a year, to be able to get the efficiencies that comes from managing our business that way, and for the contractors to be able to achieve the cost savings that come from being able to manage our work in that fashion. And so, in short, I'm not trying to be hyperbolic. We see it as a disaster to go back to 1-year rate making. Sort of the last comments I have are around options on process and how do we move forward coming out of here. You didn't ask for us to opine on this, so we realize this is just our 2 cents. But what we took away from the comments over the last day and a half is that just tossing this to a working group and say figure it out is not likely to lead to a good outcome. There are parties that just continue to fundamentally oppose multi-year plans, and I don't think it's likely that they're going to come around in a work group process. So that if the fundamental direction is we want to explore this further, we would suggest that the commission make a decision based on the information that's in the record, and maybe that information isn't fully developed right now. Commissioner Suchman, you talked about disappointment that the utilities hadn't included this proposal in our initial comments. I would note that the order came out pretty quickly, August 16th, comments due September 16th. We didn't have this sitting on the shelf waiting to go. We sort of felt like there was a lot of good value in the original proposal, but when it became pretty clear, like even parties that maybe we weren't sure where they would come out, staff, MEA, we saw the initial comments, like, okay, we've got to come in with a more aggressive proposal to modify things from where they are. So that's the explanation as to why we got there. So our thought process-wise would be that you could ask the parties in their briefs to respond to this concept or offer alternatives to this concept. Right now we have, I think, 60 days roughly until the first set of briefs are due. And in fact, there's only one round of briefs, so we recommend both initial briefs and then reply briefs so parties have a chance to respond to the proposals of other parties, and the commission has the opportunity to see that. 60 days following a proceeding is kind of a long time if you wanted to make the initial briefs in mid-November and hold to your schedule for final briefs by mid-December. That works for us. I'm sure you can get other parties' opinions on that. So those, I think, were the key things we wanted to convey. Let me turn to my colleagues to see if there's anything else you wish to add.
I mean, obviously, PHI agrees with what Mr. Case has put forth, but I do want to reinforce one more thing about the state policy, because I think that's really critical here. is that the MYP is really becomes the umbrella for all the good work that's happening in the working groups, and you can see the full profile of what is in front of you and make key decisions in terms of what our future looks like. So I don't want to lose sight of that based on staff's comments. I don't think staff was saying that there's no value from a state policy perspective, but I do think the original intent was to be able to execute on the ambitious goals of the state of Maryland, and this is the perfect construct to do that, and I think we've just got to continue to keep sight on that so that we can work together and meet those goals. But thank you for your time today. Really appreciate it.
Okay, OPC.
Thank you, Chairman.
I think Mr. Lapp's here if you want to. Yeah. And I think what I want to do is hear from everybody, and then we will ask questions. And so.
Thank you, and David Lapp, LAPP for OPC, here with Mark Shibis, ZYBIST.
Yep.
I wanted, and Mr. Shibis may have a couple additional points, but I just wanted to hit on a couple things real quick. We do think that accelerated spending enabled through the MRPs does increase rates, and it promotes excessive capital spending and rate-based growth. We put in our brief numbers from the average BGE electric customer paying $145 a month for more for distribution service, or I think that's per. Actually, I should look back at the brief, but these bills are increasing by significant amounts. Those are annual increases. BGE gas customers by more than $250. Delmarva Power, $97 annual bill increase. Pepco, $172 after approval of their first MRP. So those numbers are, in our filings, and we do think they reflect the MRPs. This is not to say that rates weren't increasing before the MRPs. Of course, they were. And I would point to Pepco footnote 67 in their brief. They have some numbers. Of course, they don't state their assumptions behind their numbers, but they point out that rate base was growing prior to the MRPs. We think that actually shows that they can provide the capital and do what's needed outside of the MRPs. I would also note that Pepco's that footnote, which, by the way, quotes something from our brief and uses the term traditional rate making, when in our brief we actually use the term standard rate making, so they switched that up. But anyway, that footnote says, while advancing state climate policy may lead to investment growth in the future. So here we're hearing different things from the utilities. They seem to be saying this is facilitating, our climate needs. Pepco's brief here actually acknowledges that it may lead to investment growth in the future. And again, that does not explain whether that investment growth can be handled with historic test year rate making. And we can see evidence in Exelon's own presentations to its investors, where they promote MRPs and alternative mechanisms to their investors. They identify MRPs as drivers to their 5 to 7% annualized earnings growth. And that's because MRPs promote faster capital spending. This is reflected in the fact that the Standard & Poor's RRA rankings improved Maryland's rankings just from the mere announcement that Maryland was doing MRPs. Of course, you know that those rankings are purely from the investor perspective. They state right on them that they're not an evaluation of how effective state regulation is. They don't tell you what those numbers are, or those plans are doing for customers. And we have never seen any data suggesting that those rankings have any correlation between with the utility's actual cost of capital. I wanted to address a couple comments from staff. And I think the main takeaway that I got from staff's presentation is that any of the benefits that purported benefits that we may see from MRPs, that they can be achieved outside of MRPs. There's no reason that a lot of these things that are being talked about, greater transparency, more information. I think Commissioner Barves asked the question a couple times that the commission has the authority to require more information outside of MRPs. And really at the end of the day, it seems like staff's position to continue the MRPs is just because we've started down this road. To us, that seems like a weak reason to continue a process that many parties agree is flawed. I wanted to just address something that came up earlier about Delmarva Power. Commissioner Suchman asked the question about whether the reconciliations have all been one way. I believe that Delmarva Power is the only utility of the three that have MRPs where there's been an overcollection. My understanding is that overcollection resulted from an increase in revenues, higher than expected late payment revenues and rent charges, added customers, and some other factors. But Delmarva Power still exceeded its forecasted capital spending by over 20%. I think O&M was consistent with its forecast. So even though there was a refund in that case, it was just because they brought in more money than expected. It wasn't because they didn't spend as much as planned. And finally, I wanted to just comment on the request that you just heard that this not go to a working group if the commission does decide to proceed with MRPs. We do think that this proceeding has, we've got ideas. Many of them came out in reply briefs. We've heard some different things today. We're not sure that by briefing alone that would be sufficient if the commission does decide to proceed with MRPs in one form or another. We got the direction in 2019 that the commission had decided to move forward. We participated in a work group. We had lots of different, suggestions and ideas there. That brief that we filed with Chief Judge McLean back in 2019, we opened out saying we don't agree that the commission needs to go down this path. One sentence, the rest of it was all about, different pros and cons of different ways going forward. Actually, a lot of the comments that we made in that brief foreshadowed a lot of what we've been talking about the past couple days. Mark, do you want to?
Sure, I can just add a couple sort of high-level points. Mostly on the discussion around the need to be forward-looking. OPC fully agrees that utilities should be forward-looking in their decision-making, and the Commission should be forward-looking in its regulation. We think that's what distribution system planning is all about. We just don't think that rate-making needs to be forward-looking along the lines of MRPs to accommodate the Commission's being forward-looking in other ways. And I think, the metaphor we've sort of heard is, we need to look out of the front window rather than in the rearview mirror. And we've sort of heard about, we're on this journey toward the energy transition and decarbonization. I think where that metaphor may be a little bit flawed is that it suggests that utilities are basically cars, these single units. I think it's probably truer to say that utilities are like, and I'm focusing through the fact that my kid really loves trains, and we were just at the B&O Railroad Museum over the weekend, but maybe fairer to say that utilities are more like trains. There are a lot of different moving parts here. Different cars serve different purposes. And in sort of translating that into like the way things work in practice, we have an EV docket with a separate case and regulatory assets where those decisions are made out and budgets are created and changed as necessary. We have a distribution system planning proceeding we have a storage proceeding. We have all these different proceedings where state policy gets worked out and where there is a lot of forward-looking activity taking place right now. The question is whether the rate-making part of things needs to be forward-looking. We don't think it does. And I think it's interesting to recall that, we have state policy being implemented across all the utilities, including those that do not have MRPs. SMECO and Potomac Edison do not have MRPs. They are also participating in the EV work group and pilot. They are participating in all the various proceedings that the Commission has done. Nothing about the fact that they have standard rate making inhibits their ability to advance state policy objectives. And I think that that word inhibit is key one, and I think that came up in staff's testimony. We agree that rate making should not inhibit the advancement of state policy objectives. But we also agree that there's little that can be done within the rate making construct to advance them. And just a quick note on sort of like the notion that standard rate making is antiquated. I mean, Mr. Lapp talked yesterday about how some things that we've done for a long time are good. Thanksgiving is good. We continue to have reasons to observe it. Sort of another way to think about that is draws on my personal experience. I worked on fracking issues in Pennsylvania many years ago when hydraulic fracturing was started. When it started in Pennsylvania, the state was regulating oil and gas development under a 1984 law, 1984 Oil and Gas Act, because the state had had oil and gas development for a really long time, since the 1860s. The technologies that were being used in fracking were entirely different, well, in many respects, from the ones that had been used before, and there were many different environmental impacts. So that law needed to be changed. There are many instances where technological developments, both in the physical world and, say, in like financial world, cryptocurrency, require changes in the law to sort of adapt to these new realities. But rate making isn't as sensitive to technological or policy developments. The fundamental question of rate making is, what revenue what should the revenue requirement of utilities be? What money do they need to provide safe and reliable service and to have an opportunity to earn their rate of return? Those are the same questions now under the state policies that we have as they were 50 years ago under the state policies in place then. We just have a lot of other moving parts within the Commission to hash out what the state policy should be. Yeah, rate making should not inhibit what happens in those other proceedings. And we don't think that it is. We don't think, again, that the standard rate making process is preventing Potomac Edison from having an effective EV pilot program. So, we think in this proceeding the utilities have not shown that there is an inhibiting effect, and that OPC has shown, and staff and other parties have agreed, that it also introduces a lot of other problems, the risk shifting, the administrative burdens, and so forth. And then just on the last point, just to reemphasize Mr. Lapp's point that there's a lot of new stuff that sort of was introduced both in the reply comments and at this hearing, and if the Commission decides to proceed with an MRP, then I think we need further discussion about what the proper way to work out the details and possibly a work group for a defined number of those issues might be appropriate.
Okay, thank you. Aoba.
Your Honor, it's a little bit difficult to respond to much of what was said by Exelon on the fly, but I'm going to give it my best shot, maybe not in the most organized way.
That's fine.
At first, I heard this morning from Mr. Case that they reiterated their support for MYPs and they stand firmly behind enhancements. And then I sort of heard some attempts to kind of negotiate it out at a hearing with the Commission and with the parties. So now I heard today, a little bit different from yesterday, that they're willing to give up on most of the exogenous factors with the elimination of them with their earnings sharing mechanism, their new paradigm. But he talked about storms, sudden and expensive. Yes, major storms can be sudden and expensive, and it's my understanding, I hope it's correct, that major storms are sort of declared in a state of emergency by the governor. But yesterday I heard about smaller storms. I'm not quite sure what a smaller storm is and who declares it, but that was a strange new concept that I heard. And then today I heard about the average cost of storms over a 5-year period, and I think Mr. Oliver spoke about that before. I have heard of regulatory assets being established for certain major storms. I have heard of other proceedings for that, but putting that together with an earnings sharing mechanism, which I heard for the first time yesterday, was difficult for me to understand the true details of it. But my overall reaction is earnings sharing mechanisms, of course they don't have to be equal on side to side, but it does leave the utilities, which excuse me, with a lot of room for manipulation, and we would not be in favor of that. Then I heard we should have as an exogenous factor new business. Well, we're totally opposed to that, and as this commission will hear more as you review AOBA's testimony in 9655, is that PEPCO does not know how to give a good forecast of new business connections. They're terrible at it, just the same way they're terrible at their original forecasts and how things change throughout the MYP. Prices go up, costs go down, then they go back up again, then they exceed budgets. So we would be totally against anything that remove new business connections. If the commission, hopefully not, but continues to go down the 3-year MYP path, I don't know how to handle that, because their estimates of new customer connections and the cost of those connections are need help. Now today I heard about regulatory assets for EVs. I heard the ESM doesn't have to be symmetrical. We don't need an ESM at all. We don't need to continue down a path that several parties and even staff has said doesn't work. The current MYP process doesn't need a little tinkering up or down. It needs a major rehaul or a complete elimination. I think you heard yesterday from Mr. Oliver that AOBA would support why we are for elimination of MYPs, a 1-year forward-looking test year with no reconciliations might be a good substitute for our current process. None of the remarks that Exelon made this morning, well, all of the remarks that we heard, they ignore the actual MYP experience. There was no solution to the prudence problem with, obviously the parties are having trouble with that and the commission is having trouble with that. So I haven't heard from them. Why are you ignoring the actual experience? They want to tinker with it here, tinker with it there. None of those things that they suggested will solve the overarching problems that have been discussed by the parties. And finally, I have to say, I am a bit confused by what I heard from staff this morning. I thought I understood staff's position, and they documented throughout their comments all of the problems with the MYPs, stated them very clearly. AOBA agreed with much of what they stated. And then this morning I heard, but we're not proposing eliminating them because we shouldn't just give up on the process. But I haven't heard a good reason why. Why should we stop a process that many parties have all suggested major problems with. I haven't heard a major problem going back to traditional rate making, standard rate making. AOBA's fine with any of those words. I haven't heard anybody say what doesn't work with that. And again, AOBA will brief these issues. I'm against reply briefs in general when we talk about, in this case, because what we see is, we see PEPCO summing up its original position, whether it's in a rate case or in this case, and then we're hit with new stuff in the reply brief that we can't respond to. So I would be in favor of keeping the schedule as we have it, filing our briefs. There is time to write those briefs, and no reply briefs. We've put forth our position. Parties should not be required to keep responding to ever-changing positions and ideas. I think that concludes my remarks this morning.
Thank you.
Your Honor, could I just add one point that I forgot? I think
Sure.
just on the exogenous factors. I think one of the concerns that we would have about that, and I think you heard this morning, I wrote it down, that somehow with MRPs they went to zero in the projected rates. Now, I don't know why that was the case, and I don't want to speculate, but one of the concerns with doing projected rates and then taking different things out is that it creates the perception that there's room for rates to grow when, in fact, there might be, significant increases due to, exogenous factors. So I think it's just important to keep in mind, you do projected rates, you keep some things out that may also increase rates, but you don't really know what that is, and when you're reviewing the projected rates, it may seem like it's a lesser impact to customers than it ultimately will be when you throw in those exogenous factors.
Okay. I don't think MEA's in the room, so... Oh, actually they are. Okay. I didn't see you back there. Actually, yeah.
Hi, Sandra McLemore. on
Well,
behalf-
actually, no, you can come right there. We got room for you.
On behalf of MEA, Sandra McLemore, I would simply say that we will respond in our briefing on some of the issues that have been addressed here orally. However, with regard to the reply briefing, I tend to agree with AOBA that the initial brief would probably be sufficient.
Okay.
And that's pretty much all I have at this time.
Okay, that's fine. And Mary Perk, so why don't you just...
Emily Scarr with Maryland Perk, EMILYSCARR. I just had a smattering of thoughts. The implication of this entire discussion is that traditional rate making is not working, cannot work to meet state policy goals, or is somehow too large of a burden on commission staff, and I don't think any of that is the case. I think Maryland has done an excellent job of using existing mechanisms to meet policy goals, sometimes having to push or pull the utilities into compliance, of course. And if the utilities are not meeting goals, I don't think giving them money in advance of a prudency review is the right choice. As someone from PEPCO said yesterday, work is not a bad word. It's the job of the PSC staff to review rates. Other stakeholders have agreed that traditional rate cases are more accessible and less work for them to engage in. And so while it may be an increased burden on staff, such is the nature of the work. I think, as any of us can attest, explaining the process to ratepayers of multi-year rates is incredibly challenging, which makes public accountability very difficult. Pushing the rate-making process, which is already complicated, further into the dark for the general public is not good for people's faith in the process or in good government. None of that means that we cannot use any of these tools, planning processes, performance incentives, budget approvals for specific policy goals in the future, as we have already done for some policy goals. In power, we talked about vehicle electrification and other programs in the future. We've talked a lot about potential building electrification as an area we might need to look at alternative funding mechanisms. But adding this form of advanced recovery for the basic bread and butter of maintenance of the utility is just simply not necessary. We should not forget that they already have an opportunity to earn a robust rate of return under traditional rate making. A key reason some of the utilities are coming back yearly under traditional rate making is that they want to reduce their shareholder financial risk. There's nothing stopping them from managing their work with multi-year contracts with contractors, for example. If those costs are prudent, they will be recovered, whether it's a year later or 3 years later. Ratepayers should not be required to bear that risk by putting the money up front. I think it's been clear that the PSC has all the tools it needs to look at utility plans in advance generally and ways to look at specific policy goals and more specific programs. I've not heard any need or the benefits of multi-year plans for Marylanders. Fundamentally, as I mentioned, the multi-year plan is a financial incentive, enabling them faster recovery before prudence review. And regardless of how many other states have chosen this avenue, it doesn't mean it's best for Maryland, especially since we have been successful in meeting our policy goals without it. We're solving a problem that simply doesn't exist. While the issue of administrative burden is real for staff, I understand, I don't think it's clear that the multi-year plan actually saves staff time. I know there was some back and forth this morning with staff on this, nor that any savings for staff time are worth the increased financial risk and burden on other stakeholders. I have serious concerns about BG&E's recommendations to address reconciliation through the profit sharing buffer, whatever you call it. As Mr. Lapp explained, it doesn't address the fundamental concern of overspending, and giving ratepayers a cut of some of the financial incentives down the road is just meager at best. If that ever happens, as you said, it doesn't necessarily mean it will ever would even come up. Finally, we shouldn't ignore the political context of all of this existing. I wasn't around here, most of you weren't around at the time, but in 2019 we know there was legislative pressure to pursue alternative rate making, and that's why the pilot was launched. But no law was passed. The existence of the pilot in itself is not evidence that it needs to exist. I hope you'll take seriously the option to stop granting multi-year plans for at least the near term and end BG&E's multi-year plan through an off-ramp. I worry doing anything else without further review is just throwing good money after bad. So thanks for your time.
Thank you. And staff?
Staff would note that in its reply comments, it clearly stated that its position was not that multi-year rate plan should end, but that we were considering options for improving it. Although there did note that there were serious problems with it. Other staff comments we'll address in our brief.
Okay, so questions from the commissioners, but what I would like to do is, can we sort of have questions for the panel? And so I'm going to give everybody an opportunity to respond, but in the interest of not being here until midnight, let's try and keep our answers concise. So, Commissioner Barbe.
Okay. You know what? I don't think I have any questions. Thank you.
Commissioner Richard.
Yeah, this was very interesting to hear all the different perspectives, and I did want to, one of the things that the representative from Mary Prairie, I'm sorry, I did all these names down, I apologize. No, I think it's important to remember, the genesis of this is there was a strong interest by the utilities to have A4s of some kind. There was specific legislation, and there was a lot of interest in the legislature, and while that didn't pass, there was some commitments made that we would, the commission would have proceedings, and that from the proceedings there would be a pilot. So hopefully that's an important, I think, part of how we got to here. I think now we have a good opportunity to review, I think, what was a solid pilot, and I think we have a couple of different paths forward. I guess for the utilities, I'll just start with, I think for me, these reconciliation process, and especially the most recent one, was a shock to me. I mean, that to me was like, wow, something really went off the tracks with how this process works. I mean, one of the things, as you know, we work through is, commission is really, what is the revenue requirement going to be, because that's going to be what is front and center. That's what ratepayers are going to face. So maybe we could start with, again, with the reconciliation process, the revenue requirements, have significantly changed. When I look back at the, what we provided as far as in the order, there were specific expectations that there was going to be an adherence to budgets. We understand, I think you made some good points about maybe there are expenses that we need to go back to more of a budgeting for over 5 years. But again, it just seems like we really went out of bounds when it comes to the capital expenditures. And, both those that just went out of budget and those that just were never ever approved in the first place. So again, how would you address that issue specifically as we try to set a revenue requirement for predictability and expect that it's going to translate, through the whole, the time for the ratepayer experience? Because as I mentioned yesterday, I can't use electricity, but you're wanting to come back and say I owe more for it.
Yeah, I understand your question clearly. In BGE's first MYP, we knew to some degree that we were going to be in for a significant reconciliation. I spoke yesterday about the depreciation, which we put on appeal, and the commission advised us, paraphrasing, don't worry about it. If you're correct, you'll be made whole in reconciliation. We knew that when the commission chose to phase in rates the way it did without adjusting rate base, that was going to leave a structural deficit. Mr. Alcarengi spoke about that when he was up this morning. Moving Stride from being a surcharge that was outside of base rates to now being part of base rates created a third sort of structural deficit, if you will, that was entirely predictable 3 years ago. And then we had, I could add storms to that list, right? When you put a budget in at 0, storms happen, and so that added to it. Which is not to say everything was outside of our control. I'm going to acknowledge that, right? And we'll speak to that in our briefs as we get into that phase in the reconciliation. There were pressures. We had record inflation. We did a lot to offset that. We didn't offset it fully, but we did a lot to offset that. We'll lay that out more clearly in our brief. So I understand where your question is coming from. I think there were some unique things that took place in the first MYP that are not in place going forward. The storms remain as an issue because we still have a 0 budget in for storms. But most of those other things that I talked about, those were one-time events. We are not expecting those to repeat themselves again. We look at where we're tracking, even how many months are we through 2024? Almost 10 months through. We know we're tracking very tightly to the budget. But putting that aside, we've got the record from the first MYP, and it's left parties with concerns about are the utilities sufficiently incented to operate within the budgets that the commission has set. And so that's the genesis, if you will, for the proposal, which, again, many other states have adopted. That's the genesis for a proposal that says if we go above the forecasted levels that were set in the MYP, then we're going to eat that. We're going to eat the first chunk of it, 100%, and then maybe there's a sharing after that, if we're prudent. And then on the other hand, you want us to have better incentives to find savings. And so that's the proposal for the sharing mechanism on the other side, if we can bring in our costs below those forecasts. So we've tried to structure a proposal that's responsive to what happened in the first MYP, some of the things within our control, some of the things outside of our control, but that was the genesis for that proposal.
Okay, and then as far as looking at this sharing mechanism, I think it was MEA that suggested maybe we ought to approach this more as just a variance caps. Would that, do you think, be better suited to keeping a company within its, what was approved by the commission, and making sure that they stick to budget? Would that be an approach, or do you tell me why that's not a better approach?
I think it's very aligned directionally to what the utilities are proposing in our earnings sharing mechanism, that if we exceed the cost of our forecast with those 2 exceptions that I spoke to, not due to storms and not due to new business, but everything else, the 1,000 other categories of expenditures that we have, if we exceed those, then we're on the hook up until we get to the bottom of the deadband. And then there's some risk sharing beyond that. So not identical to what MEA said, but directionally saying the same thing. The utilities would bear greater risk if their costs exceed the forecasts that were used to set rates. John, you look like...
And if I could just add what CAPS, I agree with what Mr. Case said, but what CAPS wouldn't provide are the incentive to achieve efficiencies that would then be shared with customers. And that's really, I think, what you really want to do, and to make sure that the utilities are given the right incentives to go after efficiencies that will be shared with customers. Even efficiencies that we find that, still lead within that deadband, those efficiencies will, to the extent that they're actually annual ongoing efficiencies, be enjoyed by customers for years afterwards. And I think that is a very important feature, especially in the environment that we're in right now, where we're looking at, all of these, we had a slide that showed like 18, 20 different state policies, right, that are going to be very costly to achieve. You want to find ways to do that in the most cost-effective manner. This earnings sharing mechanism would give us the incentive to find those efficiencies that will make sure that we can also do it in the most cost-effective manner and address affordability to the best extent we can for customers.
Okay, and again, that was the MEA, suggestion, and I find it somewhat attractive, and again, it's very direct, and it seems to have less opportunity for the utilities to, I don't know, use accounting and whatever other tactics to confuse how that spending takes place. But I guess going back again to these exogenous factors, I mean, you have, one, I tend to agree that the storms, maybe we ought to go more back to budgeting. But on these other areas, it's the choice of the utility whether or not to choose a forecasted test year. Why should any of the risks of that decision go to ratepayers? Why just not make that part of your calculus, the utility calculus, as to whether or not you want to have a forecasted approach to, rather than the traditional approach, or standard approach, I guess?
Well, I think there are a lot of benefits to using the forecasted test years and the multi-year plans. We spent a lot of time on that yesterday, so that's why we're making the choice.
Back to the reconciliation.
Back to the
Why not
reconciliation.
just, if it's your decision, the utility decision to use a forecasted MYP approach, why shouldn't you, since it's your choice, to just go ahead and take that risk? Why leave that pending, as a potential impact on ratepayers?
Well, if I could, I think that, the challenge with using forecasts sometimes can be that, it's this asymmetry of information. I think that parties and stakeholders feel like they don't necessarily always have the same or, as much information about what the utility's plans are and what the cost might be, what the work might be. And so if you're looking at a forecasted test year, you don't want to just leave, it open to the utility. I mean, the utilities are not putting forth in this multi-year plan structure right now a wish list of projects, but you've heard other parties say that that's what they think that we're doing. And so I think that in order to really address that concern, you need to actually, have some sort of a mechanism like this earnings sharing mechanism that we're talking about to ensure that, that forecasting process doesn't, it addresses the risk and puts more of the risk.
Okay, right now, maybe I'm not being clear. I don't want any of the risks need to go to ratepayers. But why, if it's your decision, the utility decision, to have a forecasted test year, why, any of those exogenous, whether it's new business or state policies, why does that have to, again, loom over a potential change to the detriment of ratepayers, the revenue requirement?
Yeah, it sounds to me like you're referencing what we heard yesterday was the model in Massachusetts, where if there's any costs that exceed the forecast, then the utility has to absorb all those. And in the states that do that, they then provide 100% of the savings goes to the utilities as well. So it's a combination. You can't look at one in isolation. I'm not saying you couldn't do a model of what you've just asked about and say, utilities, it's 100% on you. If you spend a dime over these levels, then your shareholders have to absorb that. I think if there's a symmetrical balance, that is a model. I'm not saying it's the best model, but it is a model. I prefer more the win-win models where there's a sharing of risk, there's a sharing of savings, but there's a different way to do it.
Okay, well, I guess I was just trying to get to going back to why not just stick with the traditional method. And I would, you were talking about rate case fatigue. I also ask about proceeding fatigue. It just seems like we do already have a number of proceedings out there based on the, for reliability, for a lot of these state policies. And from those state policies, we do allow and provide for the utilities to come up with plans. And from those plans, I think there's a reasonable expectation the utilities can make decisions about investments and have a reasonable expectation of them being accepted. So why going to the OPC and I think AOBA and others and to Mary Perg, what is broken about what has happened in the past? We have a proceeding for state policies, have a plan that can lead to a capital expenditure work plan, and then we hold the utility to that in a traditional rate case.
Yeah, I think what's broken about it is sort of inherent in your question. There's so many new proceedings, there's so many new requirements being placed on utilities, and the suggestion that the way to manage that is to go back to the backward-looking rate case model, even with information about what the utilities are thinking ahead. To me, there's a total lack of alignment between saying...
And I'm going to end here because I know my colleagues want to get in this. We're going to be doing a lot of these proceedings anyway. I mean, to set policy, to establish what the utilities' role is going to be. So it seems like we're just adding a lot of more proceedings if we have these MYPs and have to go through all kinds of, additional. First of all the advocates, all the stakeholders have to look at your plans at the beginning of the process, and then they have to evaluate through reconciliation at the end. In addition to that, a lot of these parties have to be a part of the proceedings to set state policy, framework, whether it's, electric buses or whether it's, working on Empower or, I can list them all, the electric vehicle policy. It seems like those are already in place anyway, and those are intended to inform a traditional rate case.
Commissioner Richard, can I comment on that? I think where I was trying to go to earlier in my comments is that what the MYP can look like is the future, a roll-up of all those various proceedings, so you can make decisions looking at one full picture, and make decisions about the future. I think that's the benefit of the MYPs that we've been trying to showcase, as opposed to the backward-looking.
Well, it seems like the backward-looking part is looking out for the ratepayer. We set the proceedings, these various policy proceedings, to look to the future. It informs the traditional rate case, and then the rate case itself allows us to hold the utilities accountable to those plans. Is that's the way I've always looked at it. How is that inconsistent with again what utilities want to accomplish?
Well, I think we are held accountable under the MYPs, but I don't know if Mr. Freen wants to add.
I was just going to say, if I could, that what we know now is that historic test years don't work in the 21st century. They worked, as you were saying, in the 20th century, but in this environment where we are going through all of these proceedings, yes, there's proceedings on different things, and the policy is decided, and even certain initiatives are decided, but at some point they do have to be, the funding and how it is actually going to be done has to be decided and has to be done. At the end of the day, even OPC acknowledged that utilities must be given an opportunity to earn a fair return, and we know that in this environment, and the reason that the legislature said that there was concern about the need for alternative forms of rate making back in 2019 is because utilities under the historic test year format were not being given any opportunity to earn a fair return. And so that is why I would say this needs to be moved forward, and why I think that, looking at balanced modifications and important changes to the multi-year plan structure is something the commission should do and needs to do to make sure that utility rate making is done in a equitable, balanced, and fair way for everyone moving forward.
Okay. Well, to OPC, AOBA staff, Mary Perk, I don't really have any specific questions for you, but if you have any comments on the concerns, about rate case fatigue or any of the responses to my my inquiry, I'd welcome.
I'd love to respond. I mean, the legislature didn't pass anything in 2019, so we know that. I mean, what I'm hearing more is platitudes and conclusory statements. Historic test years don't work in the 21st century. That's not a fact-based assessment of historic test years. There's no examples of how historic test year rate making has failed in any way. What we heard from Mr. Case, what's broken is so many new proceedings, and now we're hearing this idea that we're going to somehow end other proceedings. This is a new concept, of course. I don't think I've heard it in these past 2 days, that we're going to somehow take, I don't know what it is, interconnection, EVs, storage, any of those groups, and somehow roll them up into MRPs. So I don't think we're getting, real answers to the question of what's broken. A couple other comments. I'm actually not sure, but I do think that the Massachusetts does have sharing on the upside. I don't think it's 100% on the other side, but I could be wrong. We can follow up on that. But to your question, Commissioner Richard, why should not all the risk go to the utilities? Of course, we would think that would be great, but the reality is that nobody can predict the future. So going back to our comments yesterday is, we can't predict the future, and if the utility does have to spend money, then it's going to come back, regardless of whether there's, a fixed cap or not. If something happens, they're going to come back. And the other concern about the cap concept is that I think it would encourage the utility, if there's a fixed cap and they can't go above it, we're going to see a larger projected spending because they have to be careful. So all these things, I think, are rising out of the multi-year, the construct that we have of projecting future rates. The incentives are right with historic test year rate making. Somebody said that somebody from Exelon said, caps would not provide the incentives to go after efficiency. So that was a criticism of the cap. Again, we're trying to address a problem that that there's a solution for, and that's called historic test year rate making. Under historic test year rate making, utilities have an incentive built into the structure to be cost effective. That's what's missing with MRPs. I wanted to just disagree that not that the depreciation did not make any difference in the reconciliation, but we will comment on that further in our briefs. The storms, the matters affecting the reconciliation. We think that that's the attribution to depreciation is overstated. I think that's all I have right now. Thank you.
Your Honor, I think OPC addressed much of what was said by Exelon very well. Just the one thing that I want to add, ratepayers have been subject to this new pilot for MYPs. I don't think we should experiment further and try out an earnings sharing mechanism for which we have no history. We don't know which is the right way to do it. Should it be equal percentage sharing, where should the sharing come in? I don't think we should continue with another experiment. I think we should go back to what we know works. That's all I have to add.
Perhaps I misheard, but I was just confused by the last statement where prior to the multi-area plans, utilities weren't having an opportunity to earn a fair rate of return. That's the first I'd heard that, so I don't know what that means, and that's not what I'd heard. That's new information to me.
Anything from staff?
Staff has no additional comments.
Okay. Can I just actually one thing I did write down here? Your back and forth with Commissioner Barve. It was just really about the resources issue. I just read. You have about a page and a half talking about the resources, and then the conclusion of staff is staff concludes that that its administrative burden has increased with the MRP process. So I mean, just a clarification. I think what I heard was, well, if we compared that to frequent traditional cases, historic cases, we think it would be about the same. But isn't this in the context of comparing what was happening, and that was frequent historic cases, and you're comparing that with MRPs, and your conclusion is that has been an increase in the burden? Or just clarify that for me.
Well, clearly, an MRP alone against a standard rate case does have additional administrative burdens just through the additional hearings, additional filings to be evaluated. I believe overall our conclusion was that in the absence of MRPs, there would be additional rate cases. We're not sure that overall there would be less of a burden with additional rate cases. If the commission had asked us, to comment on what's the problem during a traditional rate case, we would point out problems that we have evaluating the filing, but that hasn't been asked us. So I'm just. I would not want to say that one clearly is greater than the other. It's just that MRPs, it's just a real perception that they never end. There's always a new filing. There's always a new thing to do, and it does create the perception that it's never ending.
Okay, if I could just ask that you would, in briefs, maybe help clarify, because I find I guess it's page 9 and 10, it's not quite crystallized in my mind what the staff position is on resource burdens. I feel like other parties have said MYPs have increased those burdens, so it would be helpful for me if you could work with staff to help clarify that for me. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Sussman.
So I think what I continue to struggle with is, what does the initial MYP proposal mean? I mean, we've been talking about getting the forecast right, or the budget right, as if the budget is some sort of thing outside of what it is that you are actually intending to do. I mean, there's a proposal that has a whole list of projects that you are going to do. There's a number. You propose the number. We agree or don't agree. And then you go forth and do things that either involve sort of following through on a particular project proposal, or do something completely different, and then the number could be higher or lower. and sort of based on what other parties have said, there doesn't seem to be a real strong tie between what's initially proposed and what you end up doing. And I'm wondering if I would feel sort of better about an MYP if there's some sort of way that what you are proposing, what you're forecasting, is actually tied to what you end up doing. And then if you don't do it, that there perhaps are some consequences to it. And I'm hearing about how you're doing in terms of the budget, but I'm not hearing how you're doing in terms of what you've actually proposed. And that's the struggle I have, because that goes back to my concern about prudency. I mean, you can't really do sort of have an initial prudency determination if the proposals just keep changing, because then what does that mean? And I'm not sure. I mean, and maybe this is something that needs to be further discussed, but it just seems to me, if there's a better way to have that initial set of proposals match what you're doing, then perhaps some of the concerns raised by the parties will go away. I mean, the issues around reconciliation continue to be a challenge, but it just seems to me that initial proposal has to mean more than just, well, this is kind of where we want to go, and this is what we need to do in terms of revenue to get there.
I mean, I think enhancing the project list and making those direct ties is what we're proposing. So I don't know if there's anything you want to add to Mr. Frayne.
Well, but it's not just the initial proposal. It's actually having that match what you end up doing.
Yeah, that's what I mean, is enhancing the annual information filings so that you have that tie. I think that was part of the proposal as we made it for the enhancements to the filings that was on that slide that had all the towers.
Well, and then are there consequences to getting it wrong? And it's not just about the budget. So some of what you're proposing in this earnings risk sharing mechanism has to do with the numbers. Did we get the budget right? But what about, did we get the projects right? I mean, is there a way to have some consequences tied to that as well? And recognizing that you do need to have a little bit of flexibility, but this is the challenge with forward-looking 3 years and then asking for us to give you money, which you then turn around and charge ratepayers more for, without us even knowing if you're sort of going forward and building that project or you're doing something different.
Right. So I think, Commissioner Suchman, what I hear you saying is that what you think might help is for us to have maybe, let's say, some, specific operational metrics and things that, are committed to in the MYP filing that we could be measured against, right? Like, we are proposing the budget for, certain work around reliability, around perhaps resiliency at some point, hopefully, around even.
But it's not just budgets. I mean,
Right.
that you've heard from the parties that they go through the list of projects and they look to see whether they're reasonable, and it's wasted effort if they've kind of gone through the projects and then the project list changes. So can there be metrics, not just about how you're doing in terms of budgets, but also metrics and how well you're doing in terms of what you're proposing?
And that's exactly what I think I'm trying to propose here, is that, some of the additional enhancements that we could talk about putting into project lists, and I think even staff has, raised the issue of, like, how they look at cost benefits and such, clearly laying out quantification of what we think, a certain category of projects all driven towards reliability are going to result in terms of reliability metrics is maybe something that, could be looked at so that there's.
But also include new projects. So within the metrics are also, why are you putting in new projects? And or why is it that you're spending, $100 million in an area that you hadn't forecast, so that there is a consequence to getting it wrong. I mean, we talked about the risk, because otherwise the risk just goes on to the ratepayers. I mean, there's a benefit to you in having an MYP, but with that should also come risk. The risk shouldn't just be on the ratepayer.
Sure. So I think that this is, some of the types of enhancements that we were thinking about in terms of, what could be provided in filings. And, I think that, as I had said yesterday, I don't think that what we're talking about here in terms of modifications and improvements needs to be the end. And so, there has been discussion about performance incentive mechanisms that could be, combined with multi-year plans. And I do think that something like a performance incentive mechanism around certain metrics tied with a multi-year plan and the work that we're proposing to do in it could really be another enhancement that, would result in a stronger mechanism ultimately that helps Maryland and customers move forward.
The PIM, I mean, I don't know if it's really a PIM. I mean, having something tied to what you are proposing and having that be real, so that it's not, I mean, the OPC talks about a wish list. You come in, you're looking, doing forward looking, you've got a list of projects. They're spending time, AOB is spending time going through these projects, not knowing if they're actually even real. Those should be real, and there should be consequences, it seems to me, if you change them. And maybe having something, I mean, it just seems to me that could perhaps go a long way to addressing some of their concerns. I mean, if you really do want an MYP, I think you need to listen to what the parties are expressing in terms of their concerns. I'll tell you, I mean, I'd love to have a situation where I don't, I like seeing you, but I'd like to have a situation where I don't see you again for 3 years, and I'm sure that there's lots of other things that we can do. So the idea of not having you come back and not having you come back every year, that's very appealing. But can you work with the parties to find a way so that what you're proposing really addresses the concerns that are being raised here?
I think we absolutely can work with the parties. I think that, I hope our comments so far have shown that we are really interested in finding the right way, the best way to move forward, and, that we're willing to talk, to discuss, and open to that. We just need, it seems to us like, at this point, what would be beneficial is for the improvements that we think are sort of low-hanging fruit to be, decided upon at the end of this, made by the commission. There could certainly be further discussions about, even further enhancements to multi-year plans going forward.
I think what we've heard is that parties don't always know why we've made changes. If we had 15 projects on a project list and 13 of them happened, 2 didn't, 3 new ones did. What caused that? And I think there is an opportunity for us to do a better job of those explanations, and we'll commit to that. But sort of the other point of it is there is a degree of flexibility that makes sense. Commissioner Barve, I think yesterday, commented about his concern. Is a 3-year plan too long of a plan? Do you have enough flexibility and agility to make changes? And that's my belief. When we make changes to a plan, it's not for arbitrary reasons. There's new information coming along. Some are easy to see, right? Senate Bill 1 passes. Senate Bill 1 says we're going to eliminate purchase of receivables. What does that mean? It means we've got to reassign our IT teams to a different project now to be able to retire.
But when we approve the MYP, when it first comes in, we're also doing it based on what information you've given us. So I'm not saying that it's a bait and switch, but understand it's not just the stakeholders, it's also us, making determinations about whether what you're proposing makes sense. So when you start changing things out, there's a consequence for decisions that we've made as well. And so it just I understand the challenges of sort of flex and the need for flexibility, but this is what happens when you propose an MYP out 3 years. And so all I'm asking is that you think about ways to tighten the sort of the outlook, so that what you're and maybe and sort of you can build a little bit of flexibility.
Yeah.
But
Point understood, and we commit that we have to do a better job of when changes happen, having a good explanation so that other parties understand it and don't just think it was some arbitrary decision for unknown reasons.
Well, but also
And remain accountable for what we put forth in the initial filing.
right, and I think
Yes.
that's what's most important. It's not things happen, changes happen, but it's that when you're putting that initial proposal together, it's not kind of a placeholder where you're just trying to find a number so that you can determine the revenue requirement. And I mean, it has to actually have meaning.
Yes.
And that there needs to perhaps be consequences when there's a change. And
we hear you.
okay, that's fine. That's all I have.
Well, does anybody else want
Yes,
to?
let's-
Yeah, if I could just
Sure.
weigh in, I think Commissioner Suchman asked a number of times there about consequences, and what we got back in numerous responses was, we'll try and do a better job providing an explanation or providing more information. We did not hear about consequences, and I think there's a reason behind that, and I don't want to belabor this because I think you heard what I heard, but I want to read what BGE wrote in its reply brief at page 15. And what that says is BGE recognizes that the review between budgeted expenditures and the actual expenditures incurred is complex. However, BGE must always be flexible to ensure that it prioritizes work that will be most beneficial to customers and to respond to significant externalities that can reshuffle work portfolios. So I read that as pretty clearly saying we need to reshuffle work portfolios. It doesn't answer the question about consequences, but
Well, and Mr. Lapp, I invite you to, I mean, and that's what I was kind of suggesting, that the utilities think about that as an element, because that is,
Sure.
that's sharing the risk. And taking on the risk includes some consequence for getting things wrong. If you have an idea, and perhaps parties can get together before they even submit briefs to talk about whether there is a way to identify some way in which consequences can be reflected.
Sure. I mean, we're always willing to talk. My concern is that we go back to information and not consequences and accountability.
Your Honor, just briefly, I keep hearing the word enhancements, and AOBA wasn't looking for enhancements. I think Commissioner Suchman zeroed in on it when she said that the initial filing is not a placeholder. We are looking for, if you say you're going to do project A, B, C, and D, why did you do M, N, O, and P? And we are seeing huge, on a wholesale level, substitution of projects. Some projects were never started, they were never undertaken. We've seen over 100% and even more differences in the spend. So this is not a question of the word enhancement. We're going to explain better what we did. This is the question of getting it right in the first place. Getting it right. And if you can't get it right for 3 years, try to get it right for 1 year. And we'll see how that goes for a 1-year MYP.
Staff, any thought?
We'll address this in our brief.
Okay. Mr. Barbe.
Just one question. After hearing what Commissioner Suchman said, and just thinking about the way traditional rate making goes versus multi-year rate plans, I was listening to what Commissioner Suchman was saying about you getting with the parties to see if there's some sort of I guess arrangement is a bad term to use, but the question I have in my mind is that in traditional rate making, there is a real, I won't say it's a prohibition, but the implication is that we're here to regulate, not to micromanage utilities. But are you prepared for the level of micromanagement that might be necessary in order for these parties to agree with 3-year rate plans?
I think that is a concern. Just being honest, that's that was something we understood as we get into multi-year plans. We're putting forward what our plans are for the next 3 years, and it's going to invite a lot of debate that hadn't happened historically. And parties are going to disagree with some of our plans, and we just said that's fine. That's part of the structure. There's goodness in that. It's not always fun. It's challenging, but at the end of the day, we stand behind our plans and we're prepared to defend them. And if we don't do it adequately, and the commission decides to make an adjustment, we accept that as a feature of the process. I don't think micromanaging that though down to every individual project is appropriate, and particularly when you put together a 3-year plan. Emergent work is going to come along. Priorities are going to shift. We might have thought, at the beginning of a year that a particular segment was important to, let's say it's an underground cable replacement. But as the year plays out, we're seeing more faults somewhere else in the system. And so we shift our resources to say that's become a higher priority project to do. So we made a change, and perhaps we didn't explain it sufficiently, and other parties are just saying, you said you were going to work here, instead you worked here. We did it for good reason. I think you would want us to be able to make those adjustments to do the work that best serves customers. But
maybe micromanagement isn't the correct word I use. Let me say it this way. Let's say that you tell us that over the next 3 years, I'm just going to make numbers up, we want to engage in $100 million of spend, and there are 10 major projects, and each one is 10, okay? And in the middle of year 2, you discover that, okay, we got a problem. We're going to have to cancel project number 1 and 2 and implement a new project that's $20 million, same amount of money, but we're dropping 2 items off the list and adding a new 3rd item onto the list. So perhaps micromanagement isn't the word I wanted to use. Are you comfortable with the idea of having a process where you have to proactively report to everybody, we're dropping projects 1 and 2 and replacing it with this new thing, exposing yourself to possible criticism and micromanagement from other people? I mean, perhaps that's not micromanagement, but it's a level of budgeting, future budgeting transparency that you're probably not used to right now. Is that the sort of thing that you're willing to sign up for in order to support 3-year plans?
Yes. I think we signed up for that in 2020 when we filed to be the pilot utility, and the same for our PHI colleagues as they filed their multi-year plans. We understand that that's inherent in the process, is that you're producing projected capital spends, the projects that the money's going to be spent on, the benefits that are going to accrue from doing that work. And emergent work is going to come along, and circumstances are going to change, and new requirements are going to come from the PSC or the legislature or our customers, and we have to be able to adjust that, and we know parties are going to have questions. So yes, we understand that.
And you're supportive of the idea of this being something that you proactively do rather than being pestered by people like me and my staff?
Yeah, I think that's one of the criticisms that showed up in the comments, is that parties want more information as to why there were variances, not just in what a project cost, but if it was a different project altogether, and those are the enhancements that we're committed to making.
But you're prepared to be proactive?
To be proactive, yes.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Well, if I could follow up on that, though, is there a danger that in providing this extra information and explanations about, why you changed from the forecast and made differences, that we're getting a situation where reasonable people disagree? And so it's not just you saying, hey, we're not doing project A anymore, we're doing this other one. But if staff or OPC or AOBA thinks, no, you should do project A, are we going to be thrust into a position of adjudicating disputes between the company and the other parties as you're inviting them into the process, again, being respective of giving them the information and explaining, why we made the variations? Because there was a lot of discussion yesterday and today that one of the big problems with reconciliation is, well, if things have changed and we didn't get the information in time to understand why things have changed. I mean, are you opening the door now to a situation where the parties can essentially be co-managing the company?
Yeah, I don't think we want to see things evolve where other parties are running the utility business. It's our utility business. We're accountable for it. We're responsible for it. We have to make the decisions that we think are in the best interest of our customers and necessary for the safe, reliable operation of our systems. But at the end of the day, we understand that leaves us open to second guessing. Commissioner Suchman, you've talked a lot about prudency, and almost like you want more ability to get us on the back end that we made the wrong investments. We look at it from the opposite. Like, we're putting forward our plans ahead of time and inviting that scrutiny up front. If we make changes in that and we don't have a defensible answer as to why and that it was in our customers' interest, then we recognize that carries risk. But I think, by the same token, making a change for good reasons shouldn't carry a consequence. Just de facto per se, you made a change. It might have been a great change. Implementing the elimination of purchase of receivables, that's a change driven by law. And there are other changes that are not driven by law, that are driven by our judgment and our, we have a lot of smart technical people in our operations and our planning, and we're confident that we can defend the choices that we make as utility companies.
And I think some of it's actually already happening. I think what we need to do a better job of is the information sharing. Because what I'm hearing is that we do make changes, and so we need to do a better job of maybe explaining that is maybe part of it. So I think we did, as Mr. Case mentioned, we signed up for that when we filed our MYPs.
Okay. Francis, why don't I start with you? So.
Well, all I hear is about one continuous rate case, and I guess I'm just raising the question to staff, OPC, the commission. Do they have the funding to have the people to be reviewing these things all through this 3-year process? It sounds to me like a never-ending rate case, especially in view of all of the changes that we've seen in case 9655.
Just real quick, I think we're back to the point, where more information is a solution, and that really doesn't answer some of the questions that are being asked. We're not interested in micromanaging the utility, and I don't think you all are interested in micromanaging the utility. And so again, it appears to me that we're looking for a solution, to enhance the MRP when we have. We don't need a solution. We have historic test year rate making, which is time tested and works.
Yeah, I just wanted to echo that, and that I think there's broad agreement that utilities need flexibility, and that's one of the biggest benefits of traditional rate making. They're not able to give that up for an advanced plan because you couldn't do that, and we don't actually need more information. Most of the controversial issues or debate are around individual projects that would happen outside of a rate case anyway, and most of our concern isn't necessarily whether a project should happen or which one should happen. It's about the spending and the cost effectiveness of that program, which is best encouraged through traditional rate making. Commissioner Suchman, you'd asked earlier about consequences. Obviously, I've been pretty clear that I don't think we should continue with multi-year rate plans, at least in the near future, but one thing that's obviously come up is there's little consequences for overspending, and we are giving tremendous financial incentive in advance of spending that if you were to continue, one thing I would hope you would immediately do is lower the rate of return. There's no reason that the same rate of return that the utilities have been getting for bearing the risk should continue once now they are sharing, if not shifting, the burden to ratepayers. Why is the rate of return as high as it existed under traditional rate making, where they are putting the money up front and now there's advanced recovery? I would think that would lead to a lower rate of return. Again, I'm not suggesting we continue, but I would think that would be a minimum expectation of going forward with multi-year rate plans, especially when you're talking about, oh, and we'll add incentives. Like, wait a second, why are we adding additional financial incentives when we already are sort of giving a lot?
Staff.
It may not seem like it, but staff's not interested in managing the companies and how they implement their projects. We try to follow the process that the commission and the PSC sets the rules. The utility implements their work, and then we judge them at the end, and then ensure that they receive their return.
Okay, thank you very much. So the procedural order for this process called for a brief. There's been a suggestion of a reply brief and a vote against, but I guess I'd like to hear from OPC and staff whether you think a reply brief is helpful or not helpful, necessary, not necessary.
Well, if you require a reply brief, we'll be happy to file one. I mean, I think we can go either way. We're sensitive to AOBA's comments about replies, and I think MEA had the same comments. Don't necessarily disagree with that, but there are things that sometimes can be said in reply briefs that are helpful. We're always worried about sort of being sandbagged, but so we would. We can work with either way.
Staff.
Well, it's a legislative style hearing to begin with. Normally they don't have briefs. I think a single brief would be fine.
Okay, so we'll just stick with the initial brief, and if for some reason we need more explanation on something, we'll let you know. So, all right, well, thank you very much, and with that, we're adjourned.